Welcome to Anime T23, where we dive deep into the most intriguing what-if scenarios in the anime universe. In today's episode, we explore a world where Naruto, Uzumaki, the future hero of Konoha, to protect his brother. Join us as we uncover how Naruto's become Shinobi to protect his brother transforms into his greatest strength. What if Naruto parents died and Naruto become Shinobi to protect his brother? Part 7, Chapter 31. Do or do not. There is no Hiruzen looked over to the assembled Jounin standing in a line in front of his desk. His son was speaking to Kurenai. He had not even glanced his way when he entered the room. He had not been able to fix his relationship with Asuma since he returned from the capital. He was not even sure how he would go about it. Since he had lost Naruto over the Uchiha incident, Hiruzen did not want to drive anyone else away. It seemed it was a habit of his. Konohamaru was still young, and other than his drive to take the Hokage seat, Hiruzen was pleased to be able to say he was close with his only grandson. Norio was also kind to him, but Hiruzen barely ever saw him since he became a genin. He really was too old for this. What he wouldn't give for Minato to be alive or for Tsunade or Jiraiya to get themselves together enough to take over. He should have retired years ago. Are we just waiting on Kakashi? One of the Jounin asked. I'm sure my rival is making haste as we speak. Guy pronounced, his white teeth sparkling as he threw the man a thumbs up. Yeah, Asuma snorted. That sounds like Kakashi. Hiruzen smiled gently as his Jounin began to snicker among themselves. Irika tooted beneath his breath beside Hiruzen as he shuffled and reshuffled the papers on the side of the desk. If it was anyone else, Hiruzen might do something about it, but Kakashi had been through a lot. Hiruzen knew how much time the man spent at the memorial stone. He was on time for the important meetings and missions, so Hiruzen would allow him this. It had been about an hour, so he should be here soon. Mama, I didn't you all cared so much. Kakashi slipped through the window and threw a lazy salute his way. Kakashi, Guy yelled, my eternal rival. The silver-haired Jounin continued to walk and stopped on the opposite side of the line than where Guy stood. He leaned forward to look around Asuma. Sorry, did you say something? Tears streamed down Guy's face as he clutched his head in his hands. You're so hip, Kakashi. If we're all here... Hiruzen straight slowly. The Jounin received the message as they fell quiet, standing a little bit straighter. We can start this meeting. He clasped his hands together and placed them on his desk, surveying his shinobi from the shadow of the Hokage hat. The Chunin exams will commence in a week's time. We have received all RSVPs except Kiri, which should arrive any day now. This meeting is for you to present your team for the exams, he said firmly. I do not need to stress the home advantage we have, and if you do enter your teams, you must ensure that Konoha presents a united front. It has not been held in Konoha for some time, so we need to have a good showing. He let his words rest over the room for a moment before he settled back into his chair, indicating that they should proceed. Guy took a large step forward, proudly placing his fists on his hips and puffing his chest out. My team skipped last year in order to train and prepare. He grinned. They are now ready to exhibit their radiant youth for all to see. Hiruzen nodded and made a note on his scroll for Team 9. Anyone else? I would like to nominate Team 7 for the Chunin exams, Kakashi said cheerfully as he took a step out of the line. The rest of the Jounin ignored Guy's impassioned cries of, my youthful rival, in favor of voicing their thoughts. You've had them for 6 months. They're barely out of the academy. They lost the Akari triplets only 2 days ago. Kakashi held up a finger, although his shoulders remained slouched. The room settled down around him. First of all, they didn't lose them. They were playing hide-and-seek, he drawled. The children had a lovely day out in the forest, and you can't prove otherwise. Secondly, it'll be good practice for them, and there's a reduced risk of harm if they go to an exam on home soil. Hiruzen nodded, but Irika spoke up before he had a chance to speak. Kakashi, you cannot enter them, he said sternly. They are barely out of the academy. I know my students, and I do not believe it is wise to endanger them unnecessarily. Kakashi's posture straightened ever so slightly. They are no longer your students. They're my soldiers, he said, his tone sharper than usual. I decide what they do, and I am entering them for the Chunin exams. Hiruzen broke the tension before it could escalate. Kakashi was correct and well within his rights. Irika was just a bit overprotective of his students. It was an excellent quality for a teacher to possess. Unfortunately, it had no place here. Team 7 is being entered for the Chunin exams, he stated with finality. Are there any others? Asuma stepped forward abruptly. If Kakashi is entering his, then I believe my team is ready for them too. His son looked back at Kurenai, and Hiruzen could see her debating it in her head. Her step forward was much more hesitant and unsure than the other 3 jounin, but her expression was resolute. So Team 7, 8, 9, and 10 are confirmed entries for the upcoming Chunin exams. Hiruzen placed his brush down. See Nemuri after this meeting for the relevant forms that you must complete, and the ones you must get your genin to sign. The door opened behind them, and the room turned to collectively stare at the jounin commander. Shikaku looked uncharacteristically grave as he parted the group of jounin and made his way straight for Hiruzen's desk. The Nara stopped beside him and handed him a note. Hiruzen took it with a raised eyebrow. What could be so serious that he could not say it in a room full of trusted jounin? He opened the note and scanned the lines of text. He slammed it down as anger and worry shot through him. This meeting is over, he ordered abruptly. Leave the room. The group shared confused looks but did as ordered. Kakashi kept looking back with an unreadable expression, but Hiruzen remained unmoved. Finally, the door closed behind Irika, and Hiruzen activated the privacy seals around his office. Shikaku shuffled his feet. Distress was all over his normally relaxed features. Report. We just received word from one of the border patrols in the east that Arai Kanzuya has been found unconscious with minor injuries. He was surrounded by 5 of what are assumed to be mercenaries, as there have been no headbands found. Kanzuya is assumed to have killed them in self-defense, but has yet to awaken for unknown reasons. He should arrive and be placed in the ICU by tomorrow evening. We send out a medic to meet them halfway. Shikaku's frame became rigid in what was obviously an attempt to control his emotions. Hiruzen could sympathize. While as shinobi they had to have self-discipline and hide their emotions, Shikaku had grown close to Naruto. The pit in Hiruzen's gut deepened. This was not going to be good news. A couple miles east of where Kanzuya was found, the team found evidence of a large battle. They found another 19 bodies with no headbands, and a clearing with its surrounding forest was decimated by the battle. There is evidence of seals and futon jutsu, which suggests that Naruto was ambushed there. We haven't been able to find him yet. How did he not sense them coming? Hiruzen interrupted. We found seals on the bodies. Without Naruto or Jiraiya-sama, there is no way to be sure, but from initial analysis, we think it hides chakra. The implication of Shikaku's words struck deep. So they were ambushed by shinobi who had a seal designed specifically to block Naruto. Hiruzen frowned. That means this was intentional. These men were after Naruto. That's the conclusion we have reached, Hokage-sama. Hiruzen took a deep breath. What did Kiri have to say? We have sent a messenger hawk to the Mizukage to find out what happened. Shikaku replied promptly. We do know that they reached the land of fire intact, and they were able to make their way unobstructed for at least 2 to 3 hours. But Hokage-sama, I know. Shikaku, Hiruzen sighed deeply, sinking into his chair. Whoever ambushed them must have known their mission en route to be able to catch them like this. There is the possibility of a mole. Shikaku shifted on his feet, and Hiruzen recognized the signs. Shikaku, speak your mind. Hokage-sama, why was Naruto even on this mission? Shikaku demanded. He's a security risk. There was no need for him to be on this mission. We have more than enough capable jounin that we could have sent. We had a team already lined up. The Mizukage asked for an uzumaki, but we didn't have to do it, the jounin commander snapped. Usually when another village asks for one of our shinobi specifically, we not only do not send them, but we launch an investigation as to why they wanted them. It was out of my hands, Shikaka. Hiruzen knew his explanation was weak, but he had nothing else to offer the man. He would be admitting that he had been undermined, which was not something the regular forces could know. Perhaps he allowed Danzo, Hamura, and Koharu too much freedom. He had taken Danzo off the council over the Uchiha incident, but it appears that his old friend was still going behind his back. Hiruzen knew they had very different ideas about what was right for the village, but he would have thought that they could agree that Naruto should be kept safe. The Uzumaki was a rare asset, and without him their Fuinjutsu would take a significant hit. By the time the mission scroll had landed on his desk, it had been through so many channels that Hiruzen could not try to prevent it without raising suspicions. Favoritism was not an accusation to be taken lightly in this system of government. I will speak to the AMBU commander about getting teams out for the search, he continued. If there has been no body found, then he was most likely captured alive. Who else knows? The Border Patrol and I, Hokage-sama, Shikaku answered, the medic who was sent out, and a small team at the hospital. I was about to inform Naruto and Kanzuya's family and team. Don't, Hiruzen interrupted. But Hokage-sama no one else is to know, Hiruzen ordered. When Kanzuya-kun arrives, have him delivered to the hospital unseen and limit the number of medical staff who know of his condition. As far as anyone in Konoha will be aware, they are returning late from their mission. Shikaka's face twisted in frustration, but he did not argue. We cannot allow the fact that Naruto is missing to reach other villages, Hiruzen explained. With his bingo book entry, there has been increased interest in him. If we were to advertise that he was out of the village, held against his will, other villages would search for him too, and there would be no guarantee we could find him first. Hokage-sama, Naruto could be dead. Ryo deserves to know. Until Naruto is found, dead or alive, no one must know. Shikaka's face flashed through a myriad of emotions before it settled into a neutral expression. He nodded his head sharply and turned on his heel, stomping out of the office. Hiruzen sank deeply into his chair, rubbing his temples in hopes of preventing the incoming headache. He tried not to choke on the guilt and worry that swirled around his gut. He had let Naruto down a lot in his life. He had to be alive. Hiruzen was not sure he or Konoha could handle the alternative. Ryo lazily threw a kunai at Sasuke, plopping his head back onto the roof. He didn't have to look to know his teammate caught it. Their training and missions were canceled for the day, and they'd already done their physical conditioning, chakra control, and ninjutsu. Nisan and Kazune were still out on their mission, and Kiba and the rest of his friends were busy with their own teams. He hadn't realized how much time D-Ranks took up. You know you're not supposed to be throwing kunai between rooftops, right? Ryo hauled himself upright to pop his head over the edge, looking down at an annoyed Sakura. She had placed her hand on her hips, and the breeze was brushing strands of her short, pink hair into her face. We picked low buildings, he said in his defense. Nobody uses these roofs. I'm sure the AMB will like that answer as much as the last one you gave them. Sakura rolled her eyes. I suppose I should be grateful you aren't doing it over the main street this time. You talk like we would miss, Ryo scoffed as he hopped down from his perch, Sasuke mirroring him on the building opposite. We've been throwing kunai at each other for years. We don't miss. Other than the time you stabbed Naruto. Ryo scowled at a smug Sasuke. You act all quiet and broody until there's a chance to make me look bad, huh? It's my job to keep you humble, Sasuke shrugged. Someone's got to do it. Konoha thanks you for your service, Ryo bowed mockingly, pitching his voice into a nasal quality. Hey! Ryo snapped around to see a blonde girl around his height staring at him, her arms folded. A massive black object was strapped to her back, visible between the four spiky pigtails. A slightly taller boy in a loose, black jumpsuit that covered everything but his purple, painted face. Ryo raised an eyebrow at the cat ears shaped from the fabric on top of his head. You know Naruto-san? She continued. How do you know Naruto? Sakura asked in return. The girl frowned a little before answering. We met him a few years ago. He was responsible for destroying parts of my village. Nisen wouldn't do that. Rio stepped forward hotly, pointing a finger at her face. She looked over at the other boy as he shook his head. What my sister means to say is, while yes, he technically destroyed a part of Suna, he also helped us out a lot. We kinda owe him. He shrugged. Wait, I'm confused. Sakura shook her head. So is it a good or a bad thing that you know Naruto? It is the best thing that could have happened to Suna, a monotone voice interjected. He is my friend. A redhead a few inches shorter than Rio stepped forward from between the two Sunanin. In a simple black t-shirt and trousers, a thin white cloth was wrapped around him and a massive, beige gourd was attached to his back. Teal-green eyes surrounded by a ring of black locked onto Rio's, and he felt something stir in his gut. There was something about this boy. You are Uzumaki, Rio. Rio nodded even as he could feel Sasuke and Sakura tensing up beside him. The redhead stared at him impassively for another long moment before he smiled ever so slightly. You are fortunate to have Naruto as your brother. He cares for you very deeply. He speaks of you in his letters, and there is nothing he loves more than being your brother. Wait, you write letters to him. Rio blurted out. He had no idea. When Teal eyes scanned over his expression. We exchange a letter each month. I at the beginning and he at the end. We have done so since he was banned from returning to Suna 3 years ago. Rio heard Sakura whisper behind him, banned even as the same word repeated itself in his brain. Nisen told me there were other people like me out there. Rio began hesitantly, hoping he was guessing right. You're one of them, aren't you? The redhead nodded, and Rio wasn't sure what to do with that information. He never thought he would meet someone else with a tailed beast sealed within them. Who are you? Sasuke finally spoke up, eyeing the three Nin suspiciously. I'm Temari. The girl stepped forward. These are my brothers, Kankuro and Gaara. We are here representing Suna in the Chunin exams. Rio knew the Chunin exams were coming up. Nisen had so much paperwork for it before he left. But it wasn't his main concern. You said Nisen was banned from Suna. How? And how did he destroy parts of your village? What happened? I just remember him going to Suna for a transport mission. He mentioned you, Gaara, but not by name. He said that he made a new friend, and that we would meet someday. The Sunanin exchanged looks, and Rio didn't like it. Why did these strangers know stuff about Nisen that he didn't? Sure, he didn't always pay attention, and he didn't find Nisan's work interesting enough to ask about, but he was his brother. He should know when his brother gets banned from another village. Naruto-san and Kinzuya-san were framed for a series of bombings around Suna. Temari started to explain. They spent almost 10 hours evading AMBU patrols before they apprehended the actual bombers and handed them over to us. Then they, accidentally let loose a jutsu that began to destroy buildings. Naruto stopped it, but then he pissed off our father, the Kazekage, and got blacklisted. People are still talking about them, Kankuro added with a huff of amusement. Rio blinked. That didn't sound real, but it must have been. He remembered when Nisen and Kazune came back from that mission. They had been so dirty and beaten up, but all they talked about was how much Kazune hated sand, and how much Nisen hated the Kazekage. Nisen had also mentioned meeting someone like Rio and that he would tell him more when the guy came to visit, but he had said nothing about any of this. He always thought Nisen was boring paperwork shinobi that occasionally ventured out for an easy mission every now and then. He was always either at work or at home, doing chores or seals or helping someone with random stuff, but that was nothing exciting either. Was there more to Nisen that he wasn't seeing? Where is Naruto? Gaara asked. I was hoping to see him. He's out on a mission, said Sasuke, throwing Rio an unreadable look. We don't know when he'll be back. Gaara's expression didn't change, but Rio got the feeling that he was disappointed. Hey, what are you doing now? Sakura smiled nervously. We could maybe show you around, see the sights. Rio mentally shook himself out of whatever funk he had fallen into. Yeah, he forced a smile onto his face. If you're Nisan's friend, then that makes you my friend too. Gar was like him, probably went through the same shit he did when he was younger. No matter how he was feeling about this new information about Nissan, this was an opportunity to get to know someone in the same position he was in, someone who truly understood what it meant to have this burden. You sound like him. Gar tilted his head, his eyes slightly warmer, although his face remained blank. Ryo's smile melted into something more real. He set off, his teammates and the Sunanin trailing behind. Katsumi had been a medic at Konoha Hospital for 6 months. She was a junior at the bottom of the ladder. She wasn't allowed to treat anyone yet, and so far had only observed interactions with patients. She enjoyed the work, though, making sure patients were comfortable, maintaining hygiene, assisting more senior medics. She knew at 18 that she was on the right track, but she couldn't help but feel at times that she was so far behind her peers. When the hospital director had pulled her into a meeting a few days ago, she hadn't been expecting much. She opened the door to the secure wing and walked down the empty corridor, nervously looking around at the locked doors. She'd never been allowed near this place, since it was for patients under the highest levels of security. Even now, the only ones who knew about this patient were 2 top-level medics and herself. She didn't know why she was chosen, but she knew not to ask. She reached the door and unlocked it, letting herself into the almost silent room. The steady beeping of the heart monitor bounced off the sterile, white walls, and the overhead light cast a pale light. She walked up to the bed and looked down at the occupant, scanning for any signs that he might be waking up. She sighed softly as the man continued to breathe steadily, aided by the oxygen tank next to his bed. She pulled on a pair of gloves and began to proceed with her checks and procedures, testing his temperature for catheter and other assorted medical equipment that was keeping him alive. As far as Katsumi knew, the senior medics hadn't been able to figure out why he hadn't woken up. He had come in with light injuries indicating a fight, but his vitals were much weaker than they should have been. They had managed to narrow it down to some type of poison, but the expert they would normally consult on this type of case was lying in the bed. Katsumi had only interacted with Arai-sensei a couple of times since she'd started working at the hospital. He was a few months younger than her, but she would never have been able to tell if someone hadn't told her. While he did look young, his mannerisms and expertise were that of someone at least a decade older. The way he commanded the emergency department was amazing, and Katsumi hadn't heard of anyone better with poisons and antidotes. She had even heard his rants in the break room while passing in the hallways about improving medical education in the academy curriculum. Apparently, it was a subject he felt very strongly about, according to the colleagues she'd mentioned it to. The thing about Arai-sensei that Katsumi really admired, though, was his kindness. Each time they had spoken, he had been so patient and understanding, taking the time to explain concepts and definitions that she'd been unfamiliar with. He was especially good with kids, and Katsumi had heard about how he'd helped raise his youngest brother. He's the pride of Konoha Hospital. His room should be full of flowers and fruit and cards, and whatever else everyone could come up with, but it was bare. She couldn't even tell his close friends in the emergency department that he was here. Despite the level of secrecy they were being held to, Katsumi was still surprised that some mention of Arai-sensei hadn't cropped up in the gossip mill. The hospital was the worst for it among their colleagues, even as they upheld their confidentiality policies. Everyone thought he was still out on a mission. She didn't know why it had to be kept such a secret. She had been informed that he had been ambushed, but not by who or where. His family hadn't even been told, judging by the absence of Uzumaki-sama and his brother. She finished up and dropped her gloves into the waste bin. She took a moment to adjust his pillows and blankets, making sure he was as comfortable as she could. He knew he probably couldn't feel it, but she felt like it was the least she could do. "I'll see you for your dinner, Arai-sensei," she said softly. "I'll try and get the good stuff today." Her eyes lingered over him for a second longer, searching for any indication that he had heard, but there was nothing. There would probably be no improvement until the senior medics could figure out what the poison was, and subsequently, the appropriate antidote. She patted his shoulder gently and left the room, locking the door behind her. Ryo bounced on his toes as he looked up at the familiar building. Groups of kids his age and older passed by, wearing different Hittite and uniforms. His hand kept creeping towards his kunai pouch to check if he had his registration form for the exam, despite the fact he'd checked it every 5 minutes since he'd arrived. He felt a nudge on his arm and looked up to see Sakura running towards him. She stopped in front of them, her short pink hair falling back to just above her shoulders. "Where were you?" Ryo crossed his arms. "You weren't in your room this morning. I remembered I was out of bandages, so I went to get some." She shrugged. "Kanzuya would have our heads if he found out we went into the Chunin exams without medical supplies." Ryo thought that over a moment. "Damn, you're right. If you're done..." Sasuke said dryly. Ryo grinned and finally walked into the building, his teammates following in his footsteps. He navigated the halls and the stairs until he came to the back of a large crowd that was blocking the corridor. He stopped, frowning as he peered over the crowd to try and find the cause. "You brats really think you're ready for something like the Chunin exams?" An older-looking boy with bandages wrapped across parts of his face snarled. "Don't make me laugh. If you can't even get past us, then you're not worthy." A boy beside him mocked, spiky brown hair hanging from beneath a navy bandana. Ryo frowned. He was sure they had to go up another floor, but the right room number was on the door behind the two boys. His eyes widened as he watched Tenten get thrown back. "Hey!" He was held back from moving forward by Sasuke. "It's a genjutsu," Sasuke whispered in his ear. "We need to go up another floor. More people that fall for this, the less competition we have. Let's go." "But Tenten..." "She'll be fine." Ryo allowed himself to be led around the edge of the crowd by his teammates, constantly looking to check on his childhood friend. She'd picked herself back up and was now occupied by helping a boy in green spandex up off the floor. She finally looked back at him and winked. Ryo threw her a puzzled look, but he was shoved through the doorway and up the next set of stairs before she could respond. Tenten was strong. She was brilliant with weapons and taijutsu. There was no way she would let herself be pushed around like that normally. They could see the correct door, just down the hall, when a voice called out, "Ryo!" He turned abruptly, narrowing his eyes at the older girl. "What was that about, Tenten?" he asked suspiciously. "We both know you could beat that guy." She smiled awkwardly, scratching the back of her head. Tenten hadn't changed much over the years. Her long brown hair was still tied up into twin buns, and she favored the sleeveless pink shirt he remembered her getting for her last birthday. Numerous scrolls were stuffed into the two pouches attached to the waistband of her loose navy trousers. She was about his height, taller than Ryo's own teammates, but shorter than the two boys trailing after her. "Should have known I couldn't fool you, Ryo." She laughed sheepishly. "Just trying to start the exam off right. All that work trying to get people to underestimate you is going to go to waste the minute you have to fight someone. You know that, right?" Ryo raised an eyebrow. "Can't hurt," she shrugged in response. "I've waited this long to take this exam. I want every advantage I can get." She peeked around him to smile widely at Sasuke. "Keep him out of trouble, yeah," she said cheekily. "I can't be there to watch him all the time." Sasuke rolled his eyes, but Ryo could see the amused twitch at the edge of his mouth. He shot a dirty look towards the uchiha, but before he could speak, Sakura chimed in. "How do you know each other?" She looked between Tenten and Sasuke, her green eyes narrowed. "Tenten and I go way back. She's like my sister," Ryo grinned. "Nissen used to leave me with her and her dad when he ran errands and stuff. Tenten and I learned how to throw kunai together. Nissen and Kazune still help her dad out with stuff, so I would go round and practice with Tenten before she got put on her genin team last year. I brought Sasuke with me a few times since Tenten has the good practice weapons. I knew you only wanted me for my kunai." Tenten held a hand to her heart, feigning an affronted look. "Fuck off. You know I'm stuck with your dumbass regardless," Ryo laughed. "So, are these your teammates then?" He surveyed the two boys that had stopped just behind Tenten. The tallest boy had long, light brown hair that hung to his lower back, with two strands hanging over the front of his shoulders. A Hittite covered his forehead with two buckles framing his face, and he wore a beige shirt with a high collar coupled with black shorts down to his knees. Ryo blinked as he met eyes almost identical to Hinata's. Must be a Hyuga. Before he could speak, the other boy sprang forward into Ryo's face. I am Rock Lee, he yelled, striking a strange pose. I am the most youthful genin in Konoha. Ryo stared, before switching his confused gaze back to Tenten. He's always like this, she sighed. A side effect of being Guy's student? Lee interjected before she could answer. You know Guy-sensei? Ryo shrugged. He's friends with our sensei, he said casually. I'm pretty sure he was also on a genin team with Ginma, my brother's Jounin sensei. Your brother? This is Uzumaki Ryo, Tenten introduced. The grumpy one is Uchiha Sasuke, and I'm sorry I don't think we've met. She smiled sheepishly at Sakura. Haruno Sakura, his teammate, smiled back, although there was still something hesitant in her eyes. Naruto-sensei always spoke about his little brother. Lee grinned. It's an honor to finally meet someone he holds to such a high regard. If ever you need assistance, please call upon me. I will do my best to repay my debt. Why are you calling him sensei? Ryo frowned. He is the reason I was able to become the youthful shinobi I am today. He saved me. I could not have graduated from the academy without him. Wait, so he taught you? He demanded. Another thing that Nissan had kept from him. He had always thought they had such an open relationship. Nissan had never lied to him, and any question Ryo could think to ask was always answered. Between what he learned about the Suna mission, and now that Nissan apparently had a student he never thought to mention, Ryo had to wonder if he really knew his brother as well as he thought he did. We are wasting time here. All eyes turned to the Hyuga. His expression was cold, and Ryo got the feeling he was looking down at them. The older boy began to walk away. Tenten shot an apologetic look at him before she started to follow, grabbing Lee's collar and dragging him along. She shouted good luck behind her as they disappeared around the corner. He's right, Sasuke spoke up, beginning to follow them down the corridor. Ryo fell into step beside his friend, the interaction still swirling around his thoughts. Before he knew it, they had come to a door with the correct number. He entered after Sasuke and immediately spotted Kiba among the horde of applicants milling about the classroom. The place reminded him of many boring hours back at the academy, and Ryo prayed the exam wouldn't have any theory. He was practical at heart. Hey, you got in too. He bounced over to his friend. Kiba flashed a grin at him, his sharp canines peeking out over his lips. Akamaru was slumped comfortably on top of his head, almost hidden behind the fur trim of the Inuzuka's hood. Of course we did, he laughed. Did you expect anything less? Ryo reached him and held out his hand for a fist bump. He managed to coax one out of Shino, which was always an achievement, before he finally turned to Hinata. He fought down a blush as his heart skipped a beat. Hi, Hinata, he smiled, gently bumping her fist. Hi, Ryo-san, she replied quietly. Ryo kept his gaze on her before his shoulder was jostled, bringing him out of his stupor. This is such a drag. Chika? Cho! We're all here. Ryo grinned, hooking an arm around the Nara's neck. Unfortunately, he heard Shikamaru mutter beneath his breath. He vaguely heard the exclamations of Forehead and Ino Pig behind them somewhere, but he decided that he wasn't going to get into that. He almost jumped out of his skin as a booming voice echoed over the classroom. Silence, degenerates. A massive puff of smoke appeared at the front of the classroom, and a group of shinobi appeared. They all wore Konoha Hitaiate and baggy gray jumpsuits up to their chins, secured with a thin black belt. The largest of them, an intimidating man that wore a full-length black coat over his jumpsuit, glared down at them. 2 thick scars ran across his face. Ryo had never seen him before. Hijiri stood at the man's left. He was Nissan's friend from work, but they hadn't really spoken much. Sorry to keep you waiting, the large man continued, his volume much lower but his voice still as deep. I am Marino Ibiki, the proctor for the first test of the Chunin exams. Anyone who screws with me will be disqualified immediately. During this test, my word is law. The room had become deathly silent during his speech, and Rio swallowed, keeping his own mouth firmly closed. The Chunins behind Marino suddenly brandished papers, and Rio's heart fell. He stepped forward to grab one, and hurriedly took a seat, trying to dampen the panic rising in his throat. He was not good at paper tests. He barely scraped by in half the subjects at the academy, and somehow he doubted that history was going to be on this piece of paper. His eyes found Kiba 3 rows back, and he could see the same dread in his friend's eyes. Kiba was even worse at math than he was. His attention was drawn back to the front as Marino continued his speech. There are 10 questions. 9 of them are on the paper in front of you, and you have 45 minutes in which to answer them. The last and 10th question will only be released after 45 minutes, and you will have a further 15 to answer it. In the case of even one person on the team getting 0 points, everyone on that team will fail. Rio tightened his grip around the pencil. Anyone caught cheating 5 times will be disqualified with their entire team. There will be no questions or assistance. The Chunin lining the walls of this room are there to monitor you. Marino cast one last stern look across the room. Begin! Rio flipped over the paper and read the first question. Absolutely not. The next question, even worse. He skipped his eyes over each of the questions, the pit of dread in his stomach only growing as he realized he didn't even know where to begin. None of this had been in the academy curriculum. He lifted his head to frantically find any sort of clue, but everyone's head was down. Sakura looked up briefly and caught his eyes. He smiled reflexively at the worried look in her eyes, trying to give the reassurance he didn't feel he had. He looked back down at the questions, pressing pencil to paper, and started on the first question. The page began to fill up, but Rio knew that none of it was right. He had hoped if he just started writing something that he would find the answer on the way, but that wasn't happening. His legs thumped repeatedly against the underside of the desk as he fidgeted nervously, his mind racing to find some way around this test. He could cheat. Marino said they had to be caught 5 times, which meant he had a chance. Rio eyed the Chunin closest to him, and the woman stared passively back at him. He swung his head back down, his legs still bouncing. How could he do this? What could he do? You are halfway through. Rio flinched and snapped his wide eyes to the clock. Where had the time gone? He hadn't done anything yet. He still had to answer at least one question. Rio-san? A tiny voice spoke up next to him. He turned to stare at Hinata. In his panic, he hadn't even noticed she had sat next to him. Normally, he was always aware of his crush. It just made him more aware of how thrown off by the exam he was. You can copy mine if you want, she said quietly. A small burst of hope exploded in his chest. As he leaned over, a kunai suddenly cut in front of him, and he lurched back. It landed with a loud thunk into the paper of a Konoha genin, sitting behind Hinata. Examinee 57, you're out. Rio watched the kid be dragged out of the classroom, his 2 teammates arguing loudly behind him. The door shut with a loud bang and the room seemed even quieter than before. Rio-san? Rio smiled awkwardly at Hinata and shook his head slightly. They couldn't risk it. The female Chunin was already looking at them, and he didn't want to get Hinata disqualified for trying to help him. She seemed to get the message and resumed her own test, throwing him small glances every so often. Rio did the best he could, but in his heart he knew he hadn't got a single one right. He could only hope the 10th question would be something he could answer. Time is up for the 9 questions. Here's the 10th. Rio sighed heavily before looking up at Marino, his resolve hardening into steel. He would get this question right. He didn't care what it took. First, you must choose if you want to answer this 10th question. Marino continued. If you choose to take it and answer incorrectly, then you will have to relinquish your right of taking the Chunin exams forever. Rio gulped, banned from taking the Chunin exams. Being a genin forever. His goal to overtake Nissan would never be realized. He would never be able to become Hokage. But I will give you a chance to go back. There was something off about Marino's sadistic grin. For those of you who aren't confident, you can choose not to take it and take the exam next year or the year after that. His deep chuckles echoed over the silent room. "Those who will not be taking it, raise your hands. Once I confirm your number, I'll ask you to leave." Rio was startled as the guy next to him raised his hand. Arms started rising around the room, and people began to file out the door. He noticed Hinata moved her hand, and he reached out to grasp it firmly in his own. She turned stunned eyes towards him, and he smiled. "You can do this, Hinata." He nodded firmly, giving her hand a tight squeeze. He looked up and met the eyes of his teammates. Sasuke wasn't going anywhere, and after a moment of hesitation, Sakura nodded back at him determinedly. Maybe he would never be able to take the Chunin exams ever again, but that didn't matter. He was going to pass this Chunin exam, and he couldn't do that if he failed at the first hurdle. His teammates would be fine. He would not be the one to let them down. He would never be able to face Nissan if he gave up now. Marino swept his gaze over the room, and as the last genin left the room, he folded his arms. No one else moved, and he nodded. "You have all passed the first exam." Rio blinked. "Huh. Hey, what does that mean?" Sakura called out from behind them. "What's the 10th question?" "That was the 10th question," Marino replied amusedly. "Will you stay or will you go?" You all answered correctly by staying. We have been mounting pressure on you all from the beginning, with the looming threat of dragging down your teammates. And when you made that choice to stay, regardless of what you could lose, you proved yourselves worthy of being a Chunin. A shinobi cannot back down when things get hard, no matter the circumstances. Rio slumped back into his seat, the tension leaving him in one breath and turning his limbs to jelly. He did it. He passed. He finally realized he was still holding Hinata's hand and abruptly let go. His face burning with a bright blush he was sure was visible from even the next room. Hinata was looking away from him, but Rio could swear her own cheeks glowed. He was about to say something when one of the windows shattered, scattering glass all over the floor of the classroom. A woman landed lightly, and Rio couldn't help but stare. In a fishnet jumpsuit, her modesty was only covered by a tan leather skirt and a beige overcoat. Her spiky purple hair was tied up, and her kanoa hattate was partially hidden by her bangs. Well done, brats, for passing the first stage, but the fun is just beginning. The scantily clad woman grinned, her purple eyes wild and gleeful. "I'm Mitarashi Enko, and I'm the proctor for the second stage of the exam. Follow me, brats." She proceeded to march out of the room. After a moment, Rio scrambled to his feet, meeting up with Sasuke and Sakura and following the strange woman out the door. Chapter 32. I want to break free. Naruto sat out a mouthful of blood onto the cold dirt floor, smiling through his reddened teeth at the tall man in front of him. "Go fuck yourself." The man snarled and punched him in the face once again. Naruto's head snapped to the side, but he refused to show the pain on his face. His loose, red hair fell across his eyes, and he turned his glare back onto the Nin. "I don't know what Orochimaru-sama wants with you, but if you ask me, it's not worth it." His brown eyes flashed with fury. "You're out of the way. You're useless." "Then kill me," Naruto taunted, tasting metallic on his tongue. "If you know better than Orochimaru-sama." The man's fist tightened, but he held back, his broad frame bristling. The only door to the shed opened, and Naruto had to squint at the sudden onslaught of light. "Fuji, leave him," another male voice called out. "Orochimaru-sama wants him alive, and beating him isn't going to bring the others back." Fuji scoffed but backed down, throwing one last venomous look behind him. The door slammed shut, and Naruto could hear them locking him in once again. He blinked a few times to readjust to the dark room, hacking up another mouthful of blood. He pulled against his restraints as he tried to get the coughing under control, and his stomach attempted to expel its contents. He hadn't eaten for ages, so he was at least spared the vomit. His chest heaved as the coughing fit finally subsided, and he could think again. He didn't know how long he had been trapped here. There were no windows, and the only time he saw daylight was when the door was opened. His arms had long since gone numb, secured above his head, and his hands had been encased in a metal cage, so he couldn't even move his fingers. They'd added that restraint after the first day when he'd managed to take down another one of their number. He was then stripped down to only his trousers, so all his tattoos and wounds were on display. They even took his brace. His long hair had come free of its bindings and hung around his face, resting on his bare shoulders and almost reaching his waist. He'd tried to blow it out of his face, but was met with various degrees of success. He could feel his chest tightening with every day that passed, and he knew that when he eventually got out of here, Yakushi-sensei would confine him to a bed for as long as he could get away with. The damp Kiri air hadn't helped in the first place. They did give him water and food, but it was sporadic. He had long gotten used to the indignity of using the bathroom. They loosed his chains just enough for him to reach a corner, but left the hand restraints on. The small shed stank with the combination of all the bodily fluids he had expelled during his time here. That was something they failed to mention at the academy. The reality of being captured. He felt disgusting and humiliated, and he swore he would murder the rest of them the second he broke free. The worst part of this whole ordeal was the lack of chakra sensing. They had slapped a couple of chakra canceling on his shackles, which voided his sensing ability and his ability to use chakra. It was as horrifying and constricting as he'd imagined. Being trapped in his own head was far worse than any of the beatings. He felt adrift. Everything around him was so quiet, and he felt limited. He'd never had to focus so much on his physical senses before. They were much weaker and rustier than he remembered. There were 4 of them left. He had managed to kill most of them during the initial battle, and he'd gotten another one when they chained him up. The last one died just before they slapped the iron restraints on. He knew that wasn't helping his case. Fuji came in at least twice daily to make him pay for that, but he at least knew they couldn't kill him. They feared Orochimaru too much for that. During his time here, he'd managed to piece some of the puzzle together. The Odo Nin weren't subtle and never tried to keep their voices down. They thought he was no threat and that it didn't matter if he heard some things. Fuji had stated so repeatedly. The first discovery was that they were members of Odo Geikure. It explained why they had a music note on their hitate. There had been rumors of a new village establishing itself in recent years, but other than the Suna incident, they'd been unable to get any further information on the place. He had also learned that the leader of this new village was one of the Sannin Orochimaru. He had never met the man, but he'd heard about the experiments he conducted on the village kids before he'd fled. He still hadn't figured out how the Sannin had known where he'd be accurately enough to set up an ambush, but that was a problem for when he got back to Konoha. He scowled as the sound of laughter reached him from beyond the dirty wooden walls. Odo Geikure had been involved in the Suna incident a year and a half ago. They had exchanged messages with Takayama's blackmailer. He and Shikaka hadn't been able to find definitive proof of their involvement, but after this mess, he was confident that they could start to build a real case. Apparently, the Sannin had plans to infiltrate Konoha during the Chunin exams, but he needed Naruto out of the way. Run, one of his current guards, had been particularly vocal on this topic. From what Naruto could glean, he was annoyed that he missed out on messing with Konoha. Naruto had to give it to the Sannin. He wouldn't have been able to get near the village walls if Naruto had been present. Not even the chakra-concealing seals they'd used to ambush him could have hidden someone like the Sannin. Now he was aware of them. He would never be taken off guard again. He cursed Kumo again for updating the bingo book. He knew it would come back to bite him in the ass, but not this bad. There was also word that Orochimaru wanted him for his uzumaki genes, but the woman's voice had been too faint for him to make it out. She probably spoke the least of the 4. Most concerning was Orochimaru's true target. Naruto eyed the seals attached to his shackles, a grim satisfaction emerging as he noted the seal was almost broken. He had not seen this particular version of chakra-canceling seals before. His own looked quite different. However, all seals shared the same fundamentals. He was close. He had to get out of here. Every time Sasuke's name passed one of their lips, the sense of urgency grew. Orochimaru could not get his slimy hands on his kid. Fortunately, his guards didn't know enough about Fuinjutsu to notice the failing seals. Relief crashed over him like a wave as he finally broke the last one, and his senses were flooded with the chakra around him. 3 signatures just outside shone brightly, and Naruto closed his eyes, taking in the overwhelming amount of information. When it finally settled down, he opened his eyes and began to twist his hands. He channeled as much futon jutsu as he dared into his right arm and let out a breath as it finally fell apart. He opened and closed his fingers to try and get some feeling back into them. He channeled more futon jutsu into his right fingers and lowered it onto the shackles on his left hand. Wincing as it cracked loudly, he was finally free. He walked up to the door, monitoring the signatures carefully. He only had one chance at this. The plan had been forming in his head since he was captured. He might have been able to take 4 times the number of Shinobi, but that was before he'd been starved, beaten, and sleep-deprived for however long it had been. He also didn't have any of his tools or seals. His chakra levels were lower than he'd like, but he had a chance. Digging his fingers into a swallow stab wound in his left chest, he smeared the fresh blood onto the door, carefully marking out the seal. He took a moment to breathe before he kicked down the door, channeling chakra into the seal and lighting the wood on fire. The burning slab landed among the group of 3, and he finished the sequence of seals before they could react. Futon, Tatsumaki Terapus. The tornado appeared quickly, and soon the 3 were obscured from view. The swirling, high-speed wind would prevent them from escaping the eye of the tornado, and he pushed more chakra into the technique, gritting his teeth as he felt the strength leave his limbs. The massive wind technique suddenly whooshed up into flames, and Naruto didn't flinch at the excruciating screams that emerged from the center of the tornado. It was a nasty combination, wind and fire, but he didn't have time or the chakra to take them down one at a time. He was acutely aware that this plan had only worked due to the element of surprise. He could feel the last one rushing towards them. He dropped the technique and swallowed harshly as the charred, unrecognizable heaps of flesh and bone crumpled to the ground. He looked up in time to meet the horrified gaze of the final Odo Nin, already moving for his next technique. He couldn't dodge the kunai that buried itself into his gut, but he managed to fire out the last seal. Futon, Shiku. He'd hoped he would never have to use this jutsu. He hadn't even meant to learn it. It was on a scroll of jutsu he pulled from the library a couple years ago. He watched the dome of hardened air settle over the final enemy and kept watching as the man started to scratch at his throat, gasping for even a single breath of oxygen. Katan and Raiden jutsu were useless against this technique. There was no oxygen in the dome to fuel the fire. He waited until the man fell and his chest stopped moving before he dared to break off the technique, falling to his knees as he grasped the kunai in his side. Slumping to sit on his ass, he tried and failed to catch his breath. He was one E-rank jutsu away from chakra exhaustion on top of everything else, but he couldn't feel anyone else. He was free. He started to look around for his stuff, but his heart fell as he spotted a hint of orange surrounded by black. He managed to crawl towards a pile, holding the kunai embedded in his stomach steady. He let out a vehement fuck. The jacket Kanzuya made for him was beyond saving, as was Tenjira's brace. He dug through the rest of the pile and found odds and ends that the Odo Nin had obviously deemed not worthy of stealing. He did not have success in finding wearable clothes. He looked back to the dead Odo Nin and sighed, accepting his fate. He had to get back to Konoha. He had to help Sasuke. Ryo bounced on the balls of his feet as Sakura went to hand in the consent forms to the temporary tent on the other side of the field. Finally, he would get to do something practical. He felt far more confident about this portion of the exam than he did the last one. All they had to do was keep their scroll, steal someone else's, and get to the tower. Sasuke stood to the left of him, arms folded and glowering at anyone that looked their way. "Come on, Sasuke. We're finally going to get to do something," Ryo grinned. The uchiha shot him an unimpressed look before he continued surveying his surroundings. "We're going to be the targets," he said flatly. "At least 4 teams have been eyeing us since the exam was announced." "Seriously?" Ryo started to look around before he was lightly slapped in the back of the head. "Ow, what the fuck, Sasuke? You have the subtlety of one of Naruto's explosive seals." He rolled his eyes, recrossing his arms. "We don't need them knowing that we know. It'll make it harder to subvert their surprise attacks. This is the look underneath the underneath, stuff that Kashi-sensei likes to talk about, isn't it?" Ryo groaned. Sasuke didn't even bother to respond as Sakura came up to them. "I got it," she said, brandishing a scroll in her right hand. "I don't know if we got heaven or earth, but I figured we could check in the forest. We don't want people seeing what we have." Sasuke threw her an almost approving look, and Ryo ruffled his hair in frustration. He was by no means dumb, but his teammates were always thinking and planning. He just liked to get stuff done. "Proceed to your assigned gates." Ryo led the way, and soon they were in front of the tall metal gate, the equally tall mesh fence stretching out on either side. He took a deep breath and picked up on the different scents coming from the forest. It was similar to the forest they trained in, but there was an undertone of metallic. It made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, but he squared his shoulders. There was probably a reason it was called the Forest of Death. "Begin." Ryo set off and led the way, pushing Chakra to his feet and running up the side of the closest tree. He reached some of the middle branches and switched from the trunk, jumping between the branches until the sight of the metal gate had disappeared from view. He stopped on a particularly wide branch, and almost immediately after, the sound of both his teammates landing on the wood followed. He cocked his head as he listened to his surroundings, deeming them alone after a long moment. "Okay, we're good." Sakura pulled out the scroll from her pouch and revealed the heaven kanji. "So we need an earth scroll," Ryo stated. "We can't open it, right?" Sakura shook her head. "That would get us disqualified," she answered. She proceeded to shove the scroll into Sasuke's arms. "Sasuke-kun, you're the strongest, so you have to protect the scroll. Ryo and I can be the defense." Sasuke looked at her silently before switching his gaze to Ryo. Ryo smiled. He had long mastered Sasuke's silent methods of communication. "She's right, Sasuke," he nodded. "I'm strong, but I have more brute strength and chakra supply. You're the one who could come up with a plan as a last resort, plus you are way better at controlling your jutsu. Not that anyone is going to get past me to fight you." He smiled cockily at his friend and caught the small huff of amusement that Sasuke released. The uchiha shoved the scroll into the pouch secured at his waist. "Sakura, do you have a plan?" She looked up at him in surprise, and Ryo joined her. While the relationship between them had improved since Sakura had stopped with her fangirl nonsense and moved into Sasuke's spare room, there was still something stilted in their relationship. Ryo was satisfied that Sakura had changed and proved herself ages ago, but Sasuke still seemed to be holding back some reservations. "Yeah," she smiled gently, before her features hardened in determination. "We have 5 days. Some of the teams might try to run straight to the tower and find a scroll on the way, but I think that's going to be harder than they think. Most will probably roam the forest and ambush other teams, then make their way to the tower. Some might even try to take down more teams than necessary to cut down the competition for the next portion of the exam." She paused to take a breath. "I think the first 2 days, we should try to avoid fights, but if the chance arises, we should grab it. We have enough food, and this way we'll have the energy and stamina that the other teams who have been fighting might not have. On the 3rd day, we should hide around the tower and ambush anyone that tries to go inside. I think we can finish the exam by the 4th day, but it still gives us a whole day in case anything goes wrong." She finished her speech, and Ryo couldn't help but be impressed. His plan was to find the first team he could and keep fighting until they got a scroll. Her plan sounded like it would work better in the long term. He would be the first to admit that he sucked at looking at the bigger picture. Nisen said he got it from Kazune. "I agree," Sasuke said quietly. His friend looked at Ryo and he nodded. He was always the scout. His heightened senses, similar to the Inuzuka, meant he was hard to sneak up on. It also made him an excellent tracker, which also meant he was good at avoiding people when required. People had compared it to Nisan's sensing ability, but they were fundamentally different. Kashi-sensei liked to joke that Nisen couldn't smell the ramen in front of him. They set off and soon settled into a steady pace. Ryo huffed as he shoved the body into the large bush. Taking a step back, he scanned the shrubbery. He couldn't see any limbs poking out, so it should be good. Someone would eventually find the body, or it would be eaten. Either way, it would work itself out. He turned to the rest of his teammates. Sakura was trying to wipe the blood out of her hair, and Sasuke had just finished hiding the other bodies. It was the second day, and another team had finally found them. Their Hittite had indicated they were from AIM, and the weird umbrella one of them had used had only reinforced that conclusion. You know, he quirked an eyebrow at Sakura. I didn't think you had it in you. She sent him an annoyed look as she gave up on her attempt to clean her hair. They underestimated me. She rolled her eyes. It's not hard to surprise someone who isn't expecting anything. There's a reason they went for Sasuke first. They looked over to their last teammate, and Sasuke looked up from examining the wound on his arm. I could have handled it, he said grumpily, although there was no heat behind it. I got the other two. While they were freaking out about Sakura slitting the big guy's throat, Ryo chuckled. He knew he probably shouldn't be this nonchalant about the death of 3 people, but he grew up with this reality. They were Shinobi. They were always going to get their hands bloody at some point. Nisen had kept him mostly shielded growing up, but he'd seen a lot since he graduated. If they hadn't taken out the AIM team, then they would have been the ones being shoved into a bush. Maybe they didn't have to kill them, but he had to admit, in the long run, it was better not to have potentially hostile opponents running around. His mind flickered back to Wave, Haku's kind face flashing through his mind. That it was what he tried to tell himself, but secretly he was glad that he hadn't had to kill the AIM team himself. It was their reality, but that didn't mean he had to like it. They don't even have the right scroll, Sakura frowned, picking up the AIM team's heaven scroll. We were doing so well to avoid everyone. They were bound to find us eventually. Sasuke walked over to them. You weren't much use, Ryo. Not my problem that they decided to attack you when I was taking a leak, he huffed. Imagine coming back and finding your teammates covered in blood. If we find another Konoha team, maybe we can trade if they have a spare Earth scroll, Sakura interrupted, shoving the spare into her pocket. We should stick to the plan. What he said. Most impressive. I did not expect Konoha Genin to be so bloodthirsty. Ryo snapped around towards a voice and spotted a figure emerging from the edge of the clearing. He hadn't heard or smelt her at all. Where did she come from? She wore a long beige tunic over a black turtleneck, with a hefty purple rope acting as a belt. Her Hittite had the symbol for Kusa, but Ryo could help the sinking feeling that there was something more to this. A wave of killing intent rolled over the clearing, and Ryo was forced to his knees, gasping for breath as the panic welled up inside him. His heart sped up, and he could feel the sweat pooling into his palms. He had never felt anything like this before, like if he made one wrong move he'd die on the spot. He struggled to lift his head and watched as the enemy licked her lips. I wanted you to entertain me more, but AIM proved far more disappointing. It looks like I will have to test you myself. She pulled out several kunai, and Ryo screamed inside his head for his limbs to move. He managed to look over to his teammates and share a glance with Sasuke. The Sharingan was activated and Ryo nodded, still choking on the strong killing intent. As the Kusa-nin let forth a barrage of kunai, Ryo finally managed to move, stumbling just out of the way as the kunai landed in the spot where he had been with a loud thunk. He frantically snapped his head to his teammates and let out a shaky breath as he saw they'd managed to avoid the attack. "Who are you?" he yelled. The enemy looked at him with amused brown eyes. "Aren't you the brave one, Uzumaki Ryo?" The amusement turned sharp as she grinned. Let's see how the brave handle this. Ryo didn't have time to process the confusion before a massive snake burst out of the tree next to him. A shriek escaped him as he dove out of the way, narrowly avoiding being eaten. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Sasuke dancing around an identical snake, but he couldn't help his friend. He had to survive his own reptile. He tried to gather his thoughts, reaching for the massive well of chakra inside of him. Suiden no Jutsu. A large stream of water was expelled from his mouth, hitting the snake directly in the face. He kept it up until the point where he needed to take a breath. As he released it, the snake shook its head wildly. The eyes. Go for the eyes. He was already moving before Sasuke had finished speaking. He pulled out a kunai and sank it into the reptile's right eye and tried not to scream as the creature began to thrash around. He could barely hang on. He drove it in deeper, feeling something give, and suddenly the snake stopped. The breath was driven from him as the giant head hit the ground, dragging him along with it. He extracted his arm from the eye's socket with a loud squelch, turned to see the other snake's head filled with kunai. As one, he and Sasuke faced a Kusanine, Sakura on her feet just behind them. Very unexpected, the enemy drawled, licking her lips. I would have expected Lil Jenin to run and hide, but you have decided to stand your ground. There might be hope for you yet. Rio's eyes widened as her torso began to elongate until it resembled a snake's. She began to move towards them, but paused as Sasuke brandished their scroll. "If it's the scroll you want, I'll give it to you," he said loudly. "I'm asking you to just take it and go." The initial tiny voice in Rio's head that protested giving away their ticket to the next round was promptly squashed by the more rational side of his brain that was still shaken from the intense killing intent. He internally prayed that the woman would take up the offer and leave them alone. He knew enough to know this was a fight they would not win. "Giving up so easily, Sasuke?" the woman chuckled. "That's not like the Uchiha clan I knew." Sasuke stiffened. "Picking on little kids? Seems beneath you, Orochimaru." Rio knew that voice. He stared mouth open as Nisan dropped down in front of them, facing the woman head on. As Nisan turned his head slightly to smile at him, shock reverberated through Rio's entire being. Nisan was not wearing his mission gear or anything that Rio had seen him wear before. He wore the same plain clothes as the woman, minus the massive purple belt, and his hair was loose and matted down to his waist. Bruises and small cuts covered his face, and Rio had no doubt that they went below the line of the turtleneck. He was filthy with dirt and blood, and whatever else covering him from head to toe, with a massive blood stain covering most of his abdomen. Rio prayed it wasn't his blood. His brilliant blue eyes still shone beneath the layers of filth, but there was hollowness to his cheeks Rio really didn't like. Sweat beaded down his forehead, and as he turned back to face the women, Rio could see he was favoring his right leg. For the first time, the woman's face cracked. Her calm, amused facade faded into annoyance. "You are not meant to be here, Uzumaki." "Yeah, well, your minions were so chatty about your goals here that I felt like I didn't want to miss out." Nisan's voice was cheerful, but Rio hated it. It didn't sound like Nisan at all. It was too cold. "After all, you went to such lengths to get me away from the village. I felt I should come and show you how much I appreciated that." "You are weak," Orochimaru spat. "You cannot stop me. A fight between us would last less time than if I fought the genin." "You wound me," Nisan sighed dramatically, clutching his chest. "I would think I could last a little longer than that." Rio eyed his brother suspiciously. What was his game? He was acting so carefree, but Rio could see the tension lining his back. What was Nisan doing? Naruto kept his breathing under control as he faced the Sannin. He couldn't let the kid see how much he was hurting right now. He just had to buy time. He had stolen the clothes of the asphyxiated Otonin and managed to drag himself to the nearest town. Fortunately, he was still in fire country, and once he'd managed to track down some soldier pills and bandages, he'd run for Konoha as fast as his wounded body could take him. It had still taken hours longer than he would have liked, and on arrival, he'd immediately pinpointed Orochimaru's chakra signature. When he found it in the Forest of Death, he went directly towards it. He'd run into Anko on the way, so she should be alerting the AMBU by now. He felt the strong signatures enter the forest and let out a shaky breath. He wouldn't be able to last long. He was frankly amazed that he had even made it here. Adrenaline, protective instincts, and a small overdose of soldier pills were a hell of a combination. "I should have had you killed," Orochimaru glared, still disguised in the visage of a Kusanine. "My curiosity got the better of me. It is not often such a pure Uzumaki comes along, especially with such a strong sensing ability like yours. You would have been invaluable to my experiments." A shudder ran through Naruto. He didn't even want to think about what could have happened to him if he hadn't escaped. He had to stay strong, though. The kids could not see him falter, and neither could the Sannin. Well, maybe if you'd asked nicely. Naruto pouted. He pointedly ignored the incredulous look from Sasuke. You cannot stop me, Uzumaki. Brown eyes faded into yellow slits. I will have the uchiha. You have two choices, Orochimaru. Naruto stood taller, trying not to wince at the pain that erupted from the movement. You can try and go for Sasuke right now. I will be here to stop you. Sure, I probably wouldn't last long, but just long enough for the teams of AMBU to get here. They will fight and win, and you will die. He met the yellow eyes of his enemy head-on. Or you can leave Sasuke alone and escape before the AMBU get here. I am not going to leave Konoha, so your chances of getting back into the villages are practically none. You were right to get me out of the way before you tried something like this. You wouldn't have even gotten through the front gate, and you know that. Orochimaru, through his kidnapping, had acknowledged that Naruto was a threat, one big enough that he had to get him entirely out of the way. He may not win in a direct fight with the Sannin, even on a good day, but he was powerful in other ways. Naruto could feel his legs begin to shake, and as a cough worked its way up his throat, he firmly closed his mouth, only hacking slightly though sheer willpower. A drop of red still escaped his lips, and he felt it run down his chin. He wouldn't even be able to slow Orochimaru down if he tried something now. He begged whatever gods were out there that he would take the bluff. The man's gaze followed that droplet before snapping up to stare Naruto down once again. The AMBU teams raced ever closer, and Naruto could feel the tension rise to breaking point. Orochimaru finally shed the disguise, his true face mostly hidden by the curtain of black, greasy hair. One yellow eye still watched him. Naruto lifted his hand to form the first seal of a futon technique, trying to drive home the threat. The leaves rustled in the far distance, and Naruto took a defensive stance. Orochimaru held his own position for a second longer before he smirked. You cannot be a guardian forever, Uzumaki, he said casually. I've claimed the excellent young shinobi in this village, and if you deprive me of my prize, I will end the village of Konoha. He turned his back and walked off, fading into a purple haze until it was as if he had never been there at all. Naruto closed his eyes and expanded his range, as far as it would go. When he couldn't find the Sannin's signature, he sighed heavily, sagging into himself. He felt the signatures land behind the genin, and he turned, smiling at the shocked and terrified faces of his kids. You can continue the exam. This won't count as outside interference, since no one could have expected you to face one of the Sannin. He patted Ryo's head gently, fighting the light-headedness that was emerging as the adrenaline drained from his body. An AMBU team will follow you discreetly in case Orochimaru tries again. Nisan what? Naruto shook his head, silencing his little brother. You will be briefed after the exam. Just focus on passing, okay? He took his hand off and shoved it in his pocket, trying to hide the shaking. Go and make me proud. The three genin exchanged unreadable looks as one of the AMBU teams herded them from the clearing, promptly disappearing from view. Ryo threw one last look over his shoulder, something lurking in those violet eyes, before he turned back, marching forward. Naruto waited until they had left the area, the shaking increasing in severity. Naruto-san? Naruto tried to focus on the blurry image of the porcelain mask, just barely able to make out the design. Fakuro? What the AMBU said next was lost, as Naruto found himself staring at the canopy above. He wasn't sure when or if he'd fallen. He hadn't felt himself hit the ground. Another mask appeared in his view, a sense of urgency in their voice. Naruto looked dopely back up at them. In the next moment he blinked, but his eyes didn't reopen. Ryo stared into the canopy, watching the world wake up around him. He jolted as he felt a hand on his shoulder, looking up to see Sasuke sitting himself down beside him. They passed the time in silence for a while, Ryo's inner turmoil preventing him from speaking. He's going to be okay. He looked over at the Uchiha, and despite his words, Sasuke's face was pinched. He has to be okay. Ryo nodded and resumed staring into the leaves. He knew Sasuke would be as affected as him if anything happened to Nissan. He just couldn't process the image of his brother from the day before. That hadn't been a shinobi fresh back from an easy mission. The way they had talked, Nissan had been held captive and broke free. Kazune hadn't been with him either. Where was he? Was he in a similar state? No one had told him. His own brother had apparently been missing, and no one had rescued him. Nissan had to rescue himself. No one had told him. Hey, he didn't look at Sasuke. The sooner we're done with this exam, the sooner we can go see him. Both him and Kinzuya are waiting for us. Probably to tell us what we could improve and how to prepare for the next one. They fuss like that. The leaves began to rustle on the other side of the clearing, where they'd made camp. Sasuke stood abruptly beside him, but Ryo couldn't bring himself to move. Nissan had been captured, probably tortured, and he hadn't known. He had just been going about his life, having fun, training, while his brother was fighting to come back alive. No one had told him. Ryo, snap the fuck out of it. Sakura, wake up. He finally hauled himself to his feet, but there was no sense of urgency behind it. Sasuke threw a kunai as Sakura roused herself. What the fuck? An annoyed voice came from the bush Sasuke had aimed at, and something stirred in Ryo at the sound. Shikamaru? The Nara popped his head over the bush, soon followed by his teammates. They emerged fully and walked over to them. Ino broke off from the pair, making a beeline for Sakura. Why are you throwing kunai at us? Shikamaru scratched the back of head. So damn troublesome. I didn't know it was you, was Sasuke's curt reply. Well, now you know, the Nara said irritably. How are you guys doing? Chuji asked quietly, munching on a bag of snacks. 2 heaven scrolls, Ryo said dully. This brought attention from the pair, and they stared. Ryo shifted uncomfortably, some of the heaviness leaving his thoughts, as he was distracted from thoughts of Nissan and Kazune. Shut the fuck up, Ino pig. Go die in a hole, forehead. As a collective, the 4 boys turned to watch the squabbling girls. Ryo had noticed since Sakura had changed, her and Ino's rivalry over Sasuke had switched to just general bickering. While their language and creativity had come along in leaps and bounds, anyone could tell that they had fun during these exchanges. He couldn't understand it himself. He'd once seen Ino punch another genin for insulting Sakura, only to use that same insult a minute later. Ino flicked her long, blonde ponytail over her shoulder. So are you guys anywhere near passing? She asked flippantly, but her pale blue eyes were attentive. Actually, about that. All eyes turned to Shikamaru. He reached into a pouch and pulled out 2 scrolls, both with the earth kanji painted on. There was a brief moment of silence. No way could it be that easy, Sakura said quietly, and Ryo scoffed. They'd barely escaped with their lives yesterday from some random after Sasuke. He wouldn't call anything about the past 2 days easy. His thoughts flashed back to that image of a wounded Nissan, but he was prevented from falling back into that train of thought by Chuji. So, we just trade, right? I guess so. Sasuke handed over one of theirs and took the spare out of Shikamaru's hands. They respectively stored them away before Ryo spoke for the first time since he'd identified Shikamaru. We could stick together as we go to the tower, he suggested. Strength in numbers and all that. There was a round of nods, but Shikamaru was still looking at him strangely. Ryo moved to take point, stopping as Shikamaru followed him. I'll join you up front, his friend drawled. Ryo shrugged and set off, pushing his way past stray branches and leaves, keeping one ear out for any approaching teams. They walked in silence for a while, Ryo becoming tenser with every glance Shikamaru shot at him. Just fucking spit it out, he snapped. What's wrong? Shikamaru answered calmly. Ryo huffed and took a few more steps before he allowed his form to slump. We got attacked yesterday, he began quietly. Some guy called Orochimaru. He wasn't meant to be in the exam. He was super strong, like stronger than anyone I've ever seen. Nissan appeared and drove him off. What was Naruto doing there? Shikamaru's gaze was sharp, his brilliant brain turning over the information. I thought he was out on a mission. Yeah, he was supposed to be, Ryo shrugged, kicking at a loose leaf beneath their feet. He was hurt so bad, Shika. There was so much blood and dirt, and I didn't even see all the damage. Him and Orochimaru talked like Nissan had been held captive or something, but someone would have noticed, right? He turned desperate eyes to Shikamaru. They would have told me if Nissan and Kazune went missing, right? The Nara went silent, and Ryo's gut twisted. Tusen has been acting weird for the past week, his friend admitted. I figured it was just stress from the exams, or something since he's been so busy. He hasn't even touched the shogi board. Ryo knew that Shikamaru's father and Nissan worked closely together. They even had dinner and stuff together, and last he heard, the Jounin commander was teaching Nissan how to play shogi, like Shikamaru did for him. I mentioned Naruto's name once, just to tease him that his other half was leaving him with all the work. They worked together so much, and Jounin followed Naruto's word like it's two sands. Ryo looked over to his friend. I've never seen him react like that. Shikamaru frowned. He looked like I just stabbed him or something. He had known. Shikamaru's father had known Nissan was missing, captured and tortured somewhere. He hadn't told Ryo. Anything on Kazuha-san? He wasn't with Nissan. He answered quietly. They didn't mention him or anything. Another silence descended on them, and he jolted slightly as he felt a hand on his shoulder. Let's just get this exam over with, and you can go see him, Shikamaru said calmly, but there was a tightness around his eyes. Ryo nodded and increased his pace. The Nara for once not complaining about the exercise. Congratulations on making it through the second exam, the Hokage announced from the front of the room. The next and final part of the Konoha Chunin exams will be held a month today, in the form of a tournament. This is the last hurdle to your promotions, so give it your all. Ryo glared at the village leader. He needed to go and find Nissan and Kazune. He didn't have time to waste here. Please see the board for your first opponent. Ryo barely glanced at it, picking up the name Hyuganiji. There were a lot less participants that passed the second stage than he would have thought. There was no sign of the Odo team or the Kusa team. He knew what happened to the team from AIM. Some guy from Konoha had bowed out at the beginning, but Ryo didn't pay attention. We will see you back here in 1 month. Good luck. Ryo was about to run off when Kashi-sensei appeared. Ryo, Sasuke, Sakura, come with me. Kashi-sensei, I don't have time. I have to get to... Ryo tried to argue, but his teacher cut him off. I'm taking you to them, he said quickly, and Ryo's mouth snapped shut. He nodded, immediately following his godfather to the hospital. Chapter 33. 'Tis but a scratch. Kakashi opened the door, the disinfectant burning his nose and the slow, steady beep of the monitor echoing in his ears. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, just staring at the prone form lying on the hospital bed. His genin shoved past him, and Ryo settled himself next to his brother immediately, grasping one of the pale hands tightly. Sasuke was more reserved, but he knew the kid well enough by now to easily pick up on the distress lining every edge of his frame as he hovered on the other side of the bed. Sakura had already started crying as she stood next to Ryo, wide green eyes latching onto the sleeping form. He took a few steps forward until he was standing at the foot of the bed. He hadn't seen Naruto when he'd apparently shot through the village like a bat out of hell. He'd only heard about it after the incident, when the news reached the tower. He couldn't leave to see him. He had to wait for his team, but the information he'd managed to pick up wasn't good. As he lay among the stark white sheets, there was no indication of the blood and filth that had apparently covered him from head to toe. There were still bruises on his face, but they were faint. The medic Nin had done a great job cleaning him up. As much as Kakashi wanted to fool himself into thinking that Naruto would just spring up and beam that warm smile of his, he knew the damage went beyond what they could see. His cheeks were more sunken than he remembered, and even with the oxygen tubes attached to his nose, his breathing was shallow. Kakashi's fist tightened with every occasional rattle. He didn't think he'd ever seen the man so pale. Sweat beaded on his forehead, even though Kakashi was sure that his hands were cold. He didn't know who had done this to him, but if he ever got his hands on them, they would regret the day they came into this world. He had long since stopped referring to Naruto as Minato-sensei's kid in his head. He barely associated Naruto with the man, not like he did with Ryo. Naruto was his friend first. It had taken so long to shake the mindset that he had to take care of the eldest Uzumaki, that as the oldest in the family, it was his job to look after them. They had finally reached a place where they valued each other not for the connections they shared, but for who they were as people. Whenever Kakashi needed honesty and advice, Naruto was the first to spring to his mind. He knew that any time Naruto needed backup, he would look to Kakashi first. They were equals. Since Ryo had become a student, there had been some sort of shift. Before, he was much closer to his godson, only really seeing Naruto in relation to Ryo. Now, he tried to treat his three genin equally. This position of authority he had over his godson had changed the dynamic. While Kakashi would still die for the kid, he found that the eldest Uzumaki was easier to be himself around. He didn't have to pretend like he knew what he was doing. That night on top of the Hokage monument had gotten him through many times where he started to panic about the way he was teaching Team 7. What would Naruto say now? How would he make sure each of the kids got the training they needed? Was he going to be okay? His thoughts were interrupted by the squeak of wheels, and he turned to watch a couple of nurses push another bed into the room. His eye widened as he saw the occupant, and Sakura rushed from Naruto's side, latching onto Kinzuya's hand with a loud cry. His eye snapped to Ryo, and the crushing despair on his godson's face was almost enough to break him. Naruto! Kinzuya! Genma burst into the room, Hana close on his heels, and stopped in the middle of the room, panting harshly. His wide brown eyes switched rapidly between the two beds. Kakashi didn't remember if he'd ever seen the man so distressed. Maybe after the Kyuubi attack, but that period of time was a blur. It was startling. Genma was the most laid-back of any jounin that Kakashi knew. He could always depend on Genma to be calm in a crisis. His bandana had been messily tied, and even his sunban was absent. Hana's hair was a mess, and her chunin vest was falling off her shoulders. They had obviously rushed here as soon as they'd heard. Genma rounded on Kakashi. What the fuck happened? Kakashi could only shrug helplessly. He heard a small noise and turned to the open door to see a head pop round the corner. The man walked into the room, and Kakashi eyed his white coat and clipboard. Were they finally getting some answers? He noted the Yakushi-sensei from Genma. How did they know each other? The slim man surveyed the room and began to speak. You are the family and friends of Uzumaki Naruto and Arai Kinzuya, he said calmly. I'm his brother. He's my guardian student best friend Dash. The voices overlapped each other as everyone spoke, and the doctor held up a hand to silence them. I cannot tell you everything, he sighed. Naruto-kun listed Kinzuya-sensei as his emergency contact, and vice versa, but in this case, I can tell you a little about his condition. If you want the whole story, you will need to speak to the boys themselves. Mutters broke out in the room as more knocks came from the door. Yakushi-sensei turned and spoke through the gap in the door, closing it quietly after he finished and locking it. More people wishing to visit. He smiled sadly. For now, I will only release this information to you. It is up to you what you want to share with the rest of Konoha, but please keep in mind what Naruto-kun and Kinzuya-sensei would want. He tapped the clipboard as he gathered his thoughts, pushing his wire-frame glasses further up his nose. Kinzuya-sensei has been unconscious for over a week, he began. He sustained minor injuries, which have already been healed, during an altercation, but due to something in his system that we haven't been able to identify, he has not regained consciousness. We might have to intubate him soon, but that's a relatively straightforward procedure. He continued quickly before anyone could speak. Naruto-kun was injured in the same altercation and taken captive. He's dehydrated, starved and sleep-deprived with some wounds inflicted by blunt force trauma and kunai. There is also the matter of his chakra exhaustion and overuse of soldier pills. But we managed to pump most of the leftover pills out of his system before they could be fully absorbed. He smiled reassuringly. While that all sounds bad, he's going to be fine. It might take him a few days to wake up. He needs to replenish his chakra supply. But after a couple weeks' observation and rest, he'll even be able to go home. Something in Kakashi's chest loosened at the doctor's final words. He knew better than most that some missions required significantly less food and sleep than would otherwise be considered healthy. It was something that he himself had experienced. While unpleasant, it was not hard to recover from, especially if it had been less than a month. It probably sounded worse to the genin who had never had to go to these lengths before. Kanzuya's case was more concerning, even if Naruto's was more dramatic. But they're going to be okay, a small voice spoke up. Yakushi-sensei turned to smile kindly at Ryo. We are going to take very good care of them, he promised. They both mean a lot to us too. How long has Kazune been here? The question was flat. After a moment of silence, the doctor looked away. That is something I cannot answer. With that, the man left the room, and it descended into a hushed quiet as they processed the new information. They were startled when Gunma clapped his hands. They are going to be fine. He grinned, and Kakashi noticed he had yet to replace his missing Senbon. Have you figured out what you're going to do for the rest of the month? Naruto would riot if he thought he was holding you back, and Kanzuya would not approve either. Kakashi blinked. He hadn't even thought about that yet. His thoughts had been so consumed by Naruto's welfare he hadn't even stopped to consider that his whole team had made it to the final round. A spark of pride flashed beneath the still-present concern he had for the men lying in the beds. He was grateful to Gunma for trying to move them forward. He was always much better at that than Kakashi could ever hope to be. Gunma, are you offering?" he half-joked, trying to project a sense of normalcy for his genin. "I can help," Hana spoke up, stepping forward and crossing her muscular arms. "I can train Sakura. She needs help on the physical side of things. That was my specialty on our team." He watched his female student as she stared down into Kanzuya's sleeping face. She nodded, looking up with a sense of determination he hadn't seen from her before. "I want that," she said firmly, only a tiny wobble finding its way into her words. "I want to tell Kanzuya-sensei about my wins when he wakes up. I have to make him proud. Make sure he wakes up to something happy." Hana grinned. "Sounds like a good plan, pup." "Kashi-sensei, you gotta help Sasuke with his Sharingan," Ryo interrupted, looking as determined as his teammate. "I can go with Gunma. Sakura's right. We need to make sure Nisan and Kazune wake up to good news, which means we need to get way stronger. We can't let them worry about us." Kakashi's gaze fell onto his final genin, and Sasuke nodded sharply. His smile was hidden by the mask, but Kakashi was proud of how far his team had come. They weren't falling apart in the face of this. Instead, they were growing further. Naruto and Kanzuya did such a good job with them. He was glad he nominated them for the exam. He clapped his own hands, eyes smiling. "Then let's go make them proud," he said, intending to live up to those words just as much as his genin. Kakashi didn't know what he would do if Naruto died. He didn't think he could take losing another one of his precious people. But it was Naruto himself who helped Kakashi start to move on from the deaths of his team. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but he also treasured these genin. The least he could do was make sure the kids Naruto and Kanzuya loved more than anything in the world would be strong enough to take on anything they might face. That way he could face Naruto proudly when the younger man finally opened his eyes. A familiar rhythmic beeping slowly pushed its way through the fog, and Naruto struggled to remember where he'd heard it before. He wasn't sure what he'd been doing before this. He wasn't even sure he cared. He was so tired. The beeping persisted and Naruto frowned, feeling something in his nose that wasn't supposed to be there. The sensation was out of place enough that he tried to see what was going on, despite how heavy his eyelids felt. The bright white light seared his eyes, and he squeezed them shut tightly. The feeling started to come back to other parts of his body, and he knew he wasn't going back to sleep this time. "Naruto?" He opened his eyes a tiny bit, trying to adjust to the light. Gradually, the room faded into a more acceptable brightness, and he could start to make out his surroundings. The itchiness of stiff sheets rubbed against his skin, and when he moved his fingers experimentally, He could feel something stuck beneath his skin. He directed his gaze to the voice and saw an exhausted Shikaku. The man was on the edge of his seat, worry lining the contours of his worn expression. Naruto opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out, the sharp dryness in his throat resulting in a cough that jolted him out of position, hunching over the bunched-up, white sheets. He felt a warm hand on his back, and a glass of water appeared in front of him. He sucked greedily on the straw and almost sighed at the relief as the burning sensation faded from his throat. He slumped back against the pillows, panting slightly. Lifting a leaden arm, he finally saw the thing stuck into his arm, and 4-line. Reaching up slowly to touch the thing in his nose, the words oxygen tube came to him. He was in the hospital. Why was he in the hospital? Sasuke is fine, Naruto. He looked over to the Nara. Orochimaru can't get his hands on him. Everything is okay. I've called the doctor. You're going to be okay. Naruto stared blankly back at the man. Why wouldn't Sasuke be okay? He felt something in the back of his mind, telling him something, but he was so tired. He couldn't think right now. He just wanted to go back to sleep. So he did. The beeping returned, but this time the fog had faded away and he had no issues opening his eyes, cautious of the bright light. He turned his head and sure enough, Shikaku was sitting next to his bed, reading something in his lap, his chakra a familiar comfort. Shikaku, he said hoarsely. The Nara jumped, the book falling to the floor as he turned wide eyes on him. Naruto? Sasuke, he continued. Where is... He's okay. Shikaku reassured a bit too quickly to be mistaken for the man's usual sense of lethargy. You drove Orochimaru out of the village, and an AMBU team has been following him since. Everyone's okay. Naruto nodded, finally starting to really look at the room around him. His eyes widened as the assault of color caught him off guard. There were flowers everywhere, all different kinds and colors and vases spread across the room in a way that was both random and made perfect sense. Baskets full of other things. He could see kunai in one of them, were shoved into the corner just opposite his own bed, and he turned to look at Shikaku, confusion painted across his face. You're a popular man, Shikaku chuckled, finally settling back into the chair proper. I'm pretty sure half the village has left something for you too. Yamanaka Flowers is sold out. Naruto looked over to the other signature he had sensed and bolted up in his seat as he saw the sleeping face of his best friend. He got away. He was supposed to be okay. Why was he here? They can't find the cause, Shikaku said quietly. It's some kind of poison. Naruto knew better than trying to stand right now, but the distress rolled over him in waves. Kazuya had to be okay. He snapped his head back to the Nara, wincing slightly at the sharp movement. A cough rose up, and he shoved his face into his elbow, trying to control it. It finally subsided, and he could ask his question. What happened? Kazuya was found about a week before you appeared. We estimate you were missing about 8 days. The man rubbed his temples. We've had AMBU teams searching everywhere for you. We found Kazuya and 19 bodies in another clearing, which we had to assume was your doing. They ambushed us, Naruto interjected quietly. Odo overwhelmed me with numbers. We figured that to be the case. They didn't have it tagged, so we didn't know Odo Geikure was responsible until you turned up. We arrested the Genin team in the forest, but they didn't know anything. They were just instructed to test Sasuke by ambushing his team. Their Jounin sensei fled about the same time as Orochimaru. That's pretty much all we have, so you're going to have to fill in the gaps in your report. Naruto nodded, looking back at Kazuya. The doctor is on his way, Shikaku said somberly. He'll be able to tell you more about Kazuya's condition. Naruto sighed, closing his eyes as he tried to dampen the initial panic. He would find out what was wrong with his best friend. Until then, he had to find something to distract him. Where are Team 7? The reason your kids aren't glued to your side is because they're training for the final part of the Chunin exams. Shikaku's expression softened. We have a kind of unspoken rotation going, so there would be someone here when you woke up. They all come at least once a day. I gathered that they were determined to show you their progress when you woke up. It's been about a week since you fell unconscious, so you haven't missed the matches. Naruto smiled. He was so glad. The last thing he would have wanted was for them to waste their time sitting around waiting for him to wake up. Who's training them? He asked curiously, settling back into the pillows even as he sent glances Kanzuya's way. Kakashi has Sasuke, Hana took Sakura, and Genma has Ryo. Genma with Ryo? Naruto repeated. The pairing surprised him slightly. While they knew each other pretty well, it wasn't a training combination Naruto had ever considered. They had very different styles. That'll be an experience for him. Indeed, Shikaka chuckled, some of the tension finally leaving his frame. Naruto's gaze was drawn to the window as a signature hovered briefly outside of it. It vanished as quickly as it came. Why are the A and BU hanging around outside? He said slowly, raising an eyebrow at Shikaku. Orochimaru isn't even in the village, and he's not after me. Shikaka stared at him for a long moment before he chuckled, shaking his head with a grin. Naruto wasn't sure what he'd said, but he was glad to erase some of the stress lines on the man's face. Shikaku was supposed to be the relaxed, borderline lazy one of their team of two. He didn't suit stress. They've been hovering around outside since you arrived, the Nara replied amusedly. I'm pretty sure they have a rotation of their own going. They're worried about you. I was under the impression that A&B as a whole didn't like me very much. Naruto frowned. They're always annoyed at me, because they can't hide from you, Shikaku explained. They respect you a great deal. I would even go so far as to say they got attached to you. You're the only shinobi I know who is able to find an ANBU that's trying not to be found. Certainly the only one who would spark up random conversations with them, as if they were part of the regular forces. Naruto blushed, as his eyes scanned the baskets and flowers spread across the room. He did know the majority of the village, having worked with most of them, but he didn't think he'd left enough of an impression to warrant this. His gaze finally landed on the largest basket, and a snort escaped him. Shikaka looked over and grinned. That one is from the team at the mission assignment desk. They know me a little too well, Naruto sniggered, taking in the large pile of instant ramen cups in the beautifully woven basket. Another cough forced its way from his lungs, and Naruto bowed over, trying to move the obstruction he could feel in his throat. He finally managed to move it, and he grabbed a cup from the side, spitting out the large chunk of green mucus streaked with red. He grimaced, looked like another chest infection. He looked towards the door just before it opened, allowing Yakushi-sensei into the room. He would finally get answers about his friend. There had to be some way to help him. Jiraiya walked down the sterile, white hallway, attempting to rehearse what he was going to say. He hadn't seen his godson in over 9 years. He was almost 16 now, a long way from the determined little 6-year-old Jiraiya remembered. He wondered how much Naruto had changed. He had meant to come back sooner. Instead, he'd allowed himself to be swallowed by his information network. He kept telling himself that the time was wrong, that it wasn't the right opportunity to go back. He knew he was running away from his responsibility. The thought of Minato's reaction, if he was alive, and found out Jiraiya left his young sons to fend for themselves kept him up at night. Sarutobi-sensei had called him back to help deal with Orochimaru, and Jiraiya knew he couldn't run anymore. He had left it long enough. He knew the boy was strong, though. His bingo book entry spoke for itself, and the addition of Fuinjutsu had been a surprise. He wasn't sure how far the boy could have gotten without a teacher, but he was curious to find out what he was capable of. He could potentially pass on some of his own Fuinjutsu knowledge. Maybe finally step up as his godfather in some way. He'd left the kid with one-handed seals to keep him going, but he knew that was a pitiful offering. He finally came to the door, and he took a deep breath. He then promptly shoved the door open, grinning widely and striking a pose. The great Jiraiya-sama has arrived, he announced. Feel free to bow and sing my praises. He maintained the pose for a moment, but as the silence dragged on, he looked over to the figure sitting on the bed. His eyes widened. That couldn't be Naruto. The man sat cross-legged in the middle of the bed. The white sheets crumpled beneath him. The top half of his vibrant red hair was tied up into a topknot, while the rest hung over his shoulders in soft waves. Jiraiya could barely see the scar that had marred the kid's face when he'd last seen him. A thin silver line was all that was left. Dressed in loose black shinobi trousers and a short, sleeveless robe tied loosely around his waist. Jiraiya could see the seals he'd had tattooed onto the kid's arm, although there were modifications there that he had definitely not added. Further seals peeked out from behind his white hospital robe, but Jiraiya couldn't determine what they were from this angle. He was surrounded by at least a dozen scrolls and books open to seemingly random pages, and he had a messy notebook in his hands. He could only see a couple of words, but they seemed to be about poisons. And 4 line was attached to his non-tattooed arm, and an oxygen line was in his nose. The tubes tucked behind his ears. Blue eyes identical to Minato's stared at him from an angular face. He'd lost all his baby fat. It was hard to tell when he was sitting, but he looked like he'd be tall. His slim figure was almost pure muscle. The redhead tilted his head. Jiraiya? Gaki? Naruto scowled. I think I've grown out of that nickname, don't you think? Jiraiya paused. His godson didn't sound happy to see him. It's nice to see you finally learn some respect, He tried to joke. No more arrow sending, huh? Naruto raised a single red eyebrow. I don't think we're familiar enough to be using nicknames. Jiraiya floundered as Naruto dropped his gaze back to his notebook. While he hadn't been expecting the same 6-year-old he'd left, he wasn't prepared for outright hostility either. What are you doing here, Jiraiya? Naruto didn't even glance up at him. You wouldn't return to Konoha on a whim. Maybe I heard my godson was injured and rushed back. That response seemed to make things worse as Naruto's gaze turned cold, finally looking back up at him. I've been hospitalized several times since I was 6. You're going to have to do better than that. Jiraiya tried not to let the rising panic show on his face as Naruto scrutinized him. There was nothing left of that 6-year-old. What happened? Something clicked in Naruto's blue eyes, and Jiraiya had to swallow a large lump in his throat. That was the same look Minato used to get when he figured something out. Oh, Kage-sama called you to deal with Orochimaru, didn't he? Naruto narrowed his eyes. That's the only reason I can think of. He's worried that Orochimaru hadn't given up quite yet. If anyone would know, it'd be his old teacher, and if there was anyone better equipped to deal with him, it'd be his teammate. What happened to Gigi? Jiraiya couldn't help but ask. Naruto scoffed and harshly shoved some of his hair back over his shoulder. Things have changed in the past 10 years, Jiraiya, he scoffed. I know you don't actually care, but it may surprise you to know that people change, so stop looking at me like I've killed your godson and taken his place. Naruto? No. Naruto slammed his notebook closed. You don't get to come back after abandoning me in Rio for 10 years and pretend everything is okay. We are not close. We are not friends. We are not family. I don't need you, and you have nothing to offer me that could possibly make up for turning your back on us. Jiraiya could only open and close his mouth silently as Naruto continued, the rage burning in his eyes and his frame shaking. Do you know what I've been through? I had to get through the academy at a disadvantage to everyone else, while making sure the villagers didn't hurt Rio. I had to raise that kid from the day he was born, and from the age of 7, I had to do it on my own. No orphan fund, no backup plan, no nothing. Just Kanzuya and I desperately trying to do enough D-ranks to keep a roof over our heads. Then I adopted Sasuke and then Sakura and I got promoted, and I have to supply everyone with seals while feeling like utter shit, and there were so many days I felt like I couldn't breathe. Naruto's breathing was becoming haggard. I had to be my own parent, guardian, and Fuinjutsu teacher. I have to make sure the kids are eating. Momo is being walked. The desk is running correctly. The barrier around the village is holding. The peace is kept between the departments, that no one enters a village that is not supposed to, that the A and B are being trained in stealth. I grew up Jiraiya because I didn't have a choice. There was nobody that could give me the freedom to be a kid. That opportunity died when my parents did. He harshly swiped away some errant tears. I wouldn't have even asked for much. Maybe watch Rio when the Inuzuka couldn't. Maybe some tips for learning Fuinjutsu. Hell, I would have taken just someone to talk to that knew my parents. Kakashi fucked up as Ryo's godfather too, but you know what? He's trying. He's been making up for that for almost 5 years. He was there. I can trust him now. You haven't even sent a letter. Jiraiya's mouth was dry. It was so much worse than he'd ever imagined. What the fuck had happened? Naruto wasn't supposed to have struggled this much. Where was the support system in the village? I don't need you, Jiraiya, Naruto said quietly, and it cut deeper than the loud anger from only a moment ago. I have people that care about me. People that I can actually count on to turn up. Fuck, look around. I have a whole village. Jiraiya took in the assortments of bright flowers, covering every surface, before his attention was brought back to the redhead. I respect you as a shinobi of Konoha, and I won't ever try to make your life more difficult than it needs to be, Naruto sighed. But you will not treat me like a godson or any sort of family. You will not visit me, and you will not go near my kids. Do you understand? We're done. Jiraiya nodded quickly and backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind him. His large frame sagged against the wood as his throat tightened. He had failed completely and utterly. He would never be able to face Minato or Kushina in the afterlife. He didn't know what he expected. Sarutobi-sensei always treated him the same way no matter how long he was away from the village. That didn't automatically apply to his godson. He had royally fucked it. He was going to offer Naruto the Toad summoning contract, but he knew the redhead wouldn't take it. Not from him. He was going to offer the redhead some Fuinjutsu advice, maybe even teach him a few things. He was finally going to be able to get to know Norio, all that had crashed and burned around him. He picked himself up and started his way down the hospital corridor. Sarutobi-sensei might have some answers about what had happened to Naruto. Even with him out of the village, there was no reason his godson should have had to take on that much responsibility at such a young age. He could salvage something from this. The kid wasn't lost to him forever. He couldn't be. Naruto tapped the pages of the textbook in his lap impatiently. He was supposed to be discharged any day now, but Yakushi-sensei was taking his sweet damn time. Every time he asked, the man said just a few more days. Naruto had grown to hate those words. He knew better than to check out against medical advice. At least 8 people would be ready to escort him back immediately. So he was just stuck here. He'd been asleep for about a week, and he'd been stuck here for a further 2.5. The chest infection had been pretty bad, but he'd conquered that last week. He would even go so far as to say he'd never felt better. It had been a while since the coughing had subsided like that. He'd also managed to ditch the 4-line and oxygen tube around the same time. Yakushi-sensei had been happy to announce that this incident wouldn't lead to any long-term effects either. He had a lot of visitors when staved off the insanity for a short while. He got daily updates on his kids' training, and Hana snuck in Momo at least twice a day to see him. He was pretty sure the nurses were actively ignoring the dog because there was no way they didn't know. He was grateful either way. Shikaku had finally managed to get him to an acceptable level of shogi, and Shikamaru came in to test him occasionally, Chuji accompanying him with snacks he always offered to him. Ryo and Sasuke had finally stopped looking at him like he was about to drop any second. At least one person from the desk came in to update him. Shikaku had found out last week and promptly banned them all from visiting. Apparently, he was in a no-work zone. Yakushi-sensei and the Nara head had ganged up on him, so he was only allowed to wonder about the pile of work waiting for him. He was happy to receive all these visitors, even as he hated being seen in such a vulnerable position. There was something different in the eyes of the people who knew about his condition. Although he was recovering from the kidnapping, he knew they were seeing something else when they looked at him. He really hated it. The sooner he got out of here and back to normal, the better. He looked over to Kinzuya. Even if he were discharged, he would probably still spend most of his time here. The only difference was that he could get his own library books. Being stuck here at least gave him the opportunity to watch over his teammate. The door to their room opened, and Naruto's stomach dropped at the thought of Jiraiya coming back. He hadn't meant to go off at the sanding like that, but it had all burst out of him at once. He had meant every word, but he didn't like yelling at people, no matter who they were. It made him feel like a hypocrite after all his talks with Ryo about the same thing. A wide grin spread across his face as Gaara walked into the room, closely followed by his two siblings. Gaara, he greeted him happily. "You look great. How are you?" The fellow redhead really did look much better. The black rings were still prominent around his eyes, but there was no tension in his face. He gave off a calm, content aura, and Naruto was delighted to see it. It looked like he'd been sleeping even. A massive gourd was attached to his back, and he was dressed similarly to when they'd met in Suna. "I am well, Naruto-san," the boy said quietly, his voice even. "I believe we should be more worried about you. Please, Gaara, drop the sand." He waved his hand dismissively. "We've known each other long enough. I refuse to respond to it from now on." He grinned as Gaara huffed slightly. He had managed to get to know the kid a bit from their monthly letters. While the kid was one of few words, he was clever and thoughtful. When he did speak or write, the words were chosen carefully and were all selected for a reason. There was nothing wasted with Gaara. It was quite different from Naruto's rambling style. He had developed a more concise version for work, but at heart, he loved to talk. "How are you, Temari? Kankuro?" He turned the older pair. "Keeping out of trouble?" "More than you, apparently." Temari crossed her arms. "We were expecting a welcome. Instead, we find out you've been hospitalized this whole time." "Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't give you the welcome I promised," he apologized, hoping Gaara understood. "I absolutely promise next time you come to Konoha you'll stay with me, and we'll have a big feast." "The works." Gaara nodded and Naruto relaxed. "What are you reading?" Kankuro spoke gruffly, peering over Temari's shoulder. He seemed more awkward than his siblings, but Naruto was sure that it was just the unfamiliarity. He'd been exchanging letters with Gaara, and Temari had taught him futon. He hadn't had many chances in Suna to talk to the middle sibling, but he hoped that would change one day. "Some poison textbook?" He lifted the book to show them the cover. "I don't get most of it because isn't waking up. We need to find the poison soon, so it's all hands on deck." He nodded towards the prone form of his best friend. He spent most of his waking hours trapped in his hospital bed reading up on poisons. There had been so much. He didn't know how his friends managed to know so much about them. His initial idea had been a seal that attached to the skin and changed colors depending on the poison, but there had been too many possibilities for that to be feasible. He had then tried to narrow it down by only identifying the base of poison, like the plant of origin, but that wouldn't work either. So he just ended up going through all the textbooks he could convince people to bring him, and trying to match Kinzuya's symptoms to what he found. He didn't have to be a medic need to know that it wasn't good for someone to be in a poison-induced coma. It had already been over a month. Everything Naruto had read said that was not good, just an unnecessarily complex jargon. "What are his symptoms?" Kankuro replied, moving away to stand next to Kinzuya's bedside. "Mainly the coma," Naruto replied, subdued as he gazed at the face of his best friend. "They said something about his electrolyte balance last time they checked on him, and that his liver wasn't producing enzymes like it was supposed to. That's thickening his blood. So they've got him on blood thinners, but that's interfering with his spleen. Yakushi-sensei described it as a slow, multi-system failure. The similarity of that diagnosis to his own condition hadn't escaped him. Has his blood changed color?" Naruto sat up straighter. "Last time they drew blood, 3 days ago, Katsumi swore that it was turning green. She told me it was something to do with sulfur in his blood, but I didn't really get it." He replied quickly, "How did you know?" Kankuro kept his brown eyes on Kinzuya for a moment longer before he looked back at Naruto, the purple face paint obscuring most of his expression. "I recognize it," he said. "You won't find it in any of the textbooks. You wouldn't even hear about it outside of Suna. Knowledge of it is passed on word of mouth to a select few poison experts in the village. I only heard about it when I became a genin. I don't even know how Kinzuya could have gotten infected with it. Not even the hospital in Suna keeps samples on file. It's so rare." For the first time since he'd woken up in the hospital, hope began to bloom in Naruto's chest. "Can you cure him?" A tense silence fell over the room. "We have the antidote on file, but there's only one dose," Kankuro admitted. It takes about a year to make with some rare ingredients. If Kazuya gets it, then if anyone gets infected in the next year, they won't make it. I don't care what it takes. Naruto hopped off the bed and stared down into Kankuro's eyes. I will give anything for him to be okay. He's my brother. I can't lose him. I don't have the power to make that decision, Kankuro replied, and Naruto could hear the helplessness in his voice. If I ask, they'll send it. He turned desperate eyes to Gaara. I'll send a hawk. Consider our debt repaid with this. Temari spoke up, a glint in her eyes. You help Gaara, so we'll help Kazuya. We can cover for you, Kankuro, when we get back. Naruto felt the tears at the edge of his eyes, and he grabbed the pair, pulling them into a tight hug. He looked over his shoulder and grabbed the puppeteer, pulling the Sand siblings to his chest. Thank you, he whispered. He wasn't going to lose his first friend. Kazuya was finally going to be okay. Everything would finally be okay. Kazuya groaned as the beeping of his alarm clock pulsated through his head. He did not need this. He was exhausted. He could at least have a lion every now and again. He reached out to switch it off, but his arm wouldn't move. He frowned. All his limbs felt like lead. His body just wouldn't obey him. He opened his eyes and blinked harshly as the white light seared his eyes. He didn't remember his room getting this much daylight. His window was too small for that. Was he in someone else's bed? That did happen often enough to make sense. The beeping continued and he groaned, trying to open his eyes again. It was blurry, but he could begin to make out some shapes. He was definitely in a bed of some kind. He recognized it too, but he wasn't sure he'd ever seen it from this angle. He turned towards a beeping, but even such a small head movement was a struggle. He had to take a moment to adjust to the abrupt loss of energy before he could inspect what was not in fact an alarm clock. It was a heart monitor. Why would someone have a heart monitor in their room? He felt he was missing something big, but his brain was still so foggy. It was hard to stay on one single thought. He thought he heard something, and he adjusted his head to face the other way, almost immediately regretting it as he closed his eyes. What was wrong with him today? There was that sound again. What was it? It sounded so familiar. Kaz. He opened his eyes to see a redhead standing over him, frantic blue eyes much closer to him than he expected. Why was Naruto here? What were they doing before this? Kazuya. Kazuya opened his mouth to tell his friend that he was fine, but even as he opened his mouth, nothing came out. His throat was too dry. Even more than that, it felt hard to move. It was like it was rusty, but how could that have happened overnight? It was sore too, as if something had been shoved down it. It's okay. You don't need to talk. Naruto smiled down at him as he slumped back into his seat. What matters is that you're awake. Kazuya tried his best to convey duh across to his teammate, despite his limited capacity. Why wouldn't he wake up? Did this have something to do with whatever happened before? The memories felt like they were just out of reach. Kazuya-sensei. Kazuya turned his eyes to Yakushi-sensei, who stood just behind Naruto's shoulder. The man looked more tired than normal, which was a feat in itself. He blinked as the man shone a light into his eyes, and he blinked, annoyed even as he remained silent. Kazuya-sensei, can you understand me? Yakushi-sensei asked slowly. Do you know where you are? Kazuya nodded even as his eyes roamed the room. He was in the hospital. He would recognize this place anywhere. The fog was lifting, but it was so slow. Everything right now felt slow. He followed the doctor's instructions. He followed the pen with his eyes. He managed to weakly squeeze his hand. He was used to giving this routine, not being the one to complete it. It was to assess cognizance, especially in those who had been unconscious for an extended period of time. Kazuya-sensei, I am going to explain your condition at this point in time and the plan going forward, Yakushi-sensei said calmly. I know you cannot speak yet, but we're going to include you in the treatment as much as we can so there's no rush, okay? Please do not stress over things right now. You have a long journey ahead of you. Kazuya didn't like the sound of that. You were brought to the hospital after you and Naruto-kun were ambushed by Oto-nin on your way back to Konoha. He began and the memories started to come back to Kazuya. You were unconscious with minor injuries, but once we healed them, you remained in a coma. We managed to narrow it down to poison, but it took a long time to find the exact one. Kanzuya wondered what expert they used since he was apparently out of it. You were unconscious for 5 weeks. Kanzuya's eyes bulged at that tidbit of information. The poison broke down your body systems at a slow pace, so there won't be any long-term damage. However, due to the nature of the poison and how long you were unconscious, it will take you some time to fully recover. I suspect you'll be able to talk in as soon as a couple of days. We had to intubate you, so your throat is going to be a little sore. The physical therapy to get you moving might take you a bit longer, but we projected that you'll be back to your normal capacity in as little as 2 to 3 months. Kanzuya ran that information over and over in his head. That was a lot to deal with. 5 weeks. How much had he missed in 5 weeks? And physical therapy? That was going to be a nightmare. He had never really thought about the enemies he had poisoned before. If this is what they went through, he felt a little bad about it now. Everything's okay now, Naruto spoke up. Orochimaru was behind the whole thing. He wanted me out of the village, so I couldn't sense him infiltrating the Chunin exams. The 3rd stage is tomorrow, so I'll cheer for the both of us. So it hadn't been Naruto's outlandish conspiracy theories then? We'll leave you to rest, Kanzuya-sensei. Yakushi-sensei smiled softly. There are going to be a lot of happy people now you're awake. They left the room, and Kanzuya was left alone with his thoughts. Things were becoming foggy again. Yakushi-sensei's words were fading in importance as he felt the blanket of sleep wrap around him. He could think it over properly tomorrow. He just wanted sleep. Chapter 34. Dodgeball. Exam edition. Naruto raised his arms above his head, feeling the pleasant stretch all the way down his back. Bending down, he placed his hands flat against the ground. He shifted his center of gravity, so it was resting between his hands, and he gently lifted his legs, slowly lifting them straight above his head. Once he felt he was comfortable with that, he opened his legs into a straight split. He only maintained it long enough to test the lack of pain before he stepped back onto his feet, straightening up. He hadn't been able to do that last week. He hadn't lost much of his flexibility during his time in the hospital bed. A few physiotherapy sessions, and he was better than ever. Show off. Kanzuya watched unimpressed from his own bed. The pain in his throat had finally died down, so he was able to speak again, if a bit hoarse and croaky. Naruto had been over the moon when his brother had woken up, and even happier when Kanzuya acted like his usual self, if a bit grumpier and more stationary. No one would understand better than Kanzuya about the treatments and therapy he was receiving. That might have made it easier for the medic Nin to accept his reality. Naruto did not share the similarity. He was ready to leave the minute he woke up. I'll tell you all about the fights tonight, Naruto promised. I'll even bring the kids for a dramatic reenactment. You'd better. Kanzuya leaned his head back into the mountain of pillows. Can't believe I'm missing it. Naruto could sympathize. He would have rioted if he was deemed too injured to watch Ryo and Sasuke compete in the exam. He'd had at least 3 plans that involved a wheelchair if it came down to it. He'd been in a better condition than Kanzuya, though, on the whole, which is something he never thought he'd be able to say. He chuckled to himself, like that was going to last long. He'd probably be hunched over a toilet or coughing his guts up within the month. That was the thing with chronic conditions that was hard to explain to healthy people. No matter how bad it was, he got used to it. It was a part of his life. Some days were worse than others, but there was nothing that could fix it, no magic cure, no waking up one day with it gone. It was a burden that he would carry until the day he died, and he was at peace with that. When something happened to a person every day, they adjusted to it and their perspective changed. Naruto was sure what he would class as a good day would still horrify people without chronic conditions. It didn't mean it didn't suck or that it didn't bring him down sometimes, but he'd learned to manage it. That was the best he could hope for. Try not to cause trouble. He called behind him as he left the room, laughing at the "I've got nothing else to do" that was thrown at him just before he closed the door. Setting off down the corridor, he could feel a familiar signature approach. "Hey, Kabuto," he smiled. "Heading to watch the Chunin exams?" Yes, Naruto-san, the teen nodded. Do you mind if I walk with you? Nah, feel free. Naruto waved a hand dismissively. Kabuto fell into step beside him. He'd known Kabuto for years at this point, even if it was mainly in passing. The older boy had been in the graduation class the year before Naruto's, and he'd seen him shadowing his father around the hospital. From what Yakushi-sensei said, Kabuto was flourishing into quite the medic mean. He usually saw him around when he was delivering paperwork or picking up Kanzuya, and he didn't really speak to him much. He wasn't a part of Naruto's care, so he had no real reason to talk to the guy. It sucks that you didn't make Chunin this year, Naruto said offhandedly. I know your father was rooting for you. Maybe next year, Kabuto replied, his tone flat. Naruto shot a glance at him, but left it. It was probably a sensitive subject. They walked along in silence for a long moment before Naruto felt a short, sharp pain in his arm. He flinched, gripping the limb as he stared at Kabuto. The round glasses had turned white under reflection of the lights, and he tightened his low ponytail, securing his pale, almost white hair at the nape of his neck. Looking around, he firmly guided Naruto into one of the empty rooms. Naruto tried to shrug him off, but the strength was rapidly leaving his limbs. My master wants you out of the way, Kabuto said, shoving Naruto to the floor. Naruto glared up at him, unable to get back up as he sank into the cold tile beneath him. You're one of the hardest obstacles to invading Konoha, so have a nice rest, okay? We'll take care of the village in your absence. You're a fucking traitor, Naruto pushed through his gritted teeth. You can't betray something you never believed in. Kabuto's cold words were left to linger as he left the room, locking the door behind him. Fury raged inside Naruto, but he could feel the drugs lulling him into sleep. He never saw it coming. Kabuto was a Konoha nin. His dad had been helping Naruto for years. How could he do this? How could the same guy who volunteered all his weekends to help in the hospital turn around and betray them like this? He hadn't even been able to sense it coming. There had been nothing off. Kabuto hadn't registered as an enemy, and why would he? He was supposed to be one of them. Konoha was supposed to be safe. His eyes slid shut and the rage faded as he slipped into unconsciousness. Hiruzen surveyed the 3 lines of genin standing in the middle of the stadium grounds. He was beyond proud to see that all but 3 were from Konoha. He knew that this was mainly due to Orochimaru's interference and the arrest of the Oto team, but he was still pleased. It was unfortunate that only a few of them would make it to the tournament round. He stood, applying a minor amplifier jutsu to his throat. They had waited around long enough for the Kazekage. He was sure Razadano would be along shortly. Welcome to the 3rd stage of the Konoha Chunin exams, he began, his voice echoing over the filled stadium. Before the tournament, we will have a short preliminary round to both give the genin a chance to display their skills and to find our finalists. The sound of discontentment at his words was quiet, but still very much present. Hiruzen knew this was not the proper way of doing things. Ordinarily, they would have reduced the number of genin before the 3rd round, but circumstances had prevented this. The official statement was that they want to give the genin a chance to rest before throwing them into another fight. Unofficially, they had been so occupied by the Orochimaru and Oto Geikure situation, they'd been unable to organize a preliminary round immediately after the 2nd stage. Naruto arriving back in Konoha had only added to the chaos. He allowed his gaze to linger on Ryo for only a brief moment before he swept his gaze over the stadium. Ryo had been furious to find out that Kanzuya had arrived in the hospital and no one had told him. He'd been apoplectic about Naruto's kidnapping. Hiruzen stood by his decision, no matter the current fallout. The risk of other villages finding Naruto before they did outweighed Ryo's feelings. It was the right choice, although Hiruzen regretted that they hadn't actually found Naruto. The boy had to break himself out. Shikaku had also been noticeably colder towards him, but he hadn't been insubordinate, so Hiruzen was forced to let it fester. He really was too old for this. They are confined to the stadium grounds and have each been issued a number of paint bombs. He began to explain. The final 8 to remain untagged will progress to the next round. Anything goes and the round will end when there are 8 genin left. He hoped that no one would be killed, but it was a part of the risk of the Chunin exams. This format was brutal, even for the exams, but it was the quickest and easiest way to narrow down the pool of genin to a number acceptable for the tournament round. He knew there might be some who would argue this was in favor of Konoha, but there was only room for 2 full teams and a partial team. There were more Konoha genin than that. He sat back in his seat, nodding towards a proctor standing in front of the genin. This would be interesting at the very least. Sasuke's eyes scanned his opponents. His place in the back row gave him the best vantage point to assess his fellow genin. He had a vague idea about Team 8 and 10's capabilities. They wouldn't have changed much in the past month. The team with the spandex green bodysuit was a much bigger threat, along with the team from Suna. There were a couple older Konoha genin that Sasuke hadn't seen much of, but if he took them down quickly, it shouldn't be much of a problem. Kakashi-sensei had pushed him hard these past 4 weeks. The only breaks he'd had were for sleep, meals, and his short, daily visits to Naruto in the hospital. He knew his Sharingan had come along in leaps and bounds, and with the addition of 2 more Raiden Jutsu to his repertoire, he knew he could take down everyone here. He had to at least be able to do that. Itachi wasn't getting any weaker. If he wanted to beat the truth out of his brother one day, he couldn't let anyone stop him here. Naruto had revealed to him what he'd found on the massacre after the Uzumaki had blown a hole in their apartment wall. To think that even Shirsu and Ai had been involved. It was one thing to process the abrupt loss of his clan. It was another to realize it had been months in the making. Sasuke remembered the weeks that led up to the massacre. His father had been absent, more than usual, and there had been an air of tension around his aunts and uncles. It was only now that he could contextualize it. The anger that festered towards Konoha had very nearly consumed him, but Naruto had managed to talk him down. While the village itself had lost its trust, Naruto hadn't. Naruto had managed to get himself into a position, so something like the massacre could never happen again. He wasn't willing to let things rest for the benefit of the village. Sasuke had asked him about that. Why was he willing to potentially uproot Konoha for a dead, apparently mutinous clan? Naruto had simply replied that the Uchiha clan had been part of Konoha too. They should get the same respect as any living resident. Sasuke had said nothing in reply, but he didn't think he would be able to tell Naruto how much he owed him. He was sure that Orochimaru's intentions for Sasuke to leave the village with him would have been much more successful if Naruto hadn't been in his life. He would beat everyone in his path, hunt his brother down and force the truth out of him. He would make Itachi tell him everything. Why he did it, who the other Uchiha was, why did it have to end that way? Why leave him alive? The proctor coughed weakly, drawing his attention to the jounin. He thought his name was Hade, but he also hadn't really been listening. He was dressed almost exactly like Gama-san, down to the Chunin vest and navy bandana covering his straight, brown hair. He didn't have a sunbon in his mouth, but instead had large bags under his slightly bloodshot eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in a month. You may not leave the boundaries of the stadium grounds and keep it away from the crowds, he drawled, covering another cough. Anything goes, but I will intervene if you go for a death blow. Spread out to the perimeter. Sasuke moved to follow the instructions when he felt a nudge on his shoulder. He turned to see bright, violet eyes staring at him. Ryo had ditched his leaf-patterned jumper for a more form-fitting forest green t-shirt. His loose, black trousers were bandaged just above the start of his sandals. He'd added bracers and a light, protective gray vest, leaving most of his upper arms bare. Sasuke had to change his own outfit for the exams. His blue shirt and white shorts hadn't survived Kakashi-sensei's training, so he donned a black romper with a collar reaching his chin. It was sturdier and had light armor built into it. It also had the Uchiha clan crest proudly displayed on the back. Let's do this. Sasuke rolled his eyes but returned his teammate's fist bump. He left to stand near a wall, a plan already forming as he took in his neighbors, the redhead Gaara and one of the unknown Konoha genin. The Konoha man was older and much taller. A black bandana covered his head, small sunglasses hid his eyes, and a free-hanging black cloth covering the lower half of his face. It didn't give Sasuke much to work with in terms of his abilities, but if his plan worked, that wouldn't matter. Start. Sasuke was already halfway through his seals as Hyade's voice faded from where it echoed over the crowd. Right on, Jibashi. His Sharingan captured the attack in perfect clarity as the thin arcs of lightning bounced across the ground towards his opponent. The other genin had also started his own hand seal sequence, but he wasn't as quick as Sasuke. He jerked and seized as the technique hit him, and as the lightning began to dissipate, Sasuke immediately launched a paint bomb. It landed with a large splat on his neck. Akado Yoroi is out. Sasuke couldn't take the time to revel in his victory as he ducked to avoid the paint bomb that almost grazed his shoulder. All that speed training Kakashi-sensei made him do was really paying off. His Jounin-sensei had said it was so his body could keep up with his Sharingan, but Sasuke had a feeling it was going to come in handy for more than his dojutsu. A choked scream reached him, and looked over to see the other unknown, Konoha genin, wrapped around Chuji's neck like a snake. The boy smashed a paint bomb into Chuji's face with far more force than necessary. The Akimichi's nose was almost definitely broken. The unknown genin's expression was hidden by the same loose black mask Yoroi had worn, but his cold eyes were perfectly visible through his clear glasses. Akimichi Chuji is out. The genin retracted himself from Chuji and bent over at an odd angle to avoid another couple of bombs. Sasuke looked over his shoulder to see Ball of Sand. Was Gaara in there? It looked like the Suna genin was just going to wait this out. Tenden's weapons weren't doing anything to penetrate that barrier. What the fuck? The voice attracted the attention of the rest of the genin, and Sasuke looked back to see the unknown genin slowly being encompassed by a blanket of tiny bugs. They moved over the boy, creating a wave effect, and Sasuke roiled slightly as the boy's nose and mouth were covered. He slumped to the ground as Shino walked up to him, dropping a green paint bomb onto his back. Tsurugi Masumi is out. Sasuke shook himself out of his surprise as he launched a paint bomb towards Temari, the kunoichi slapping it away with her fan. He made a mental note to avoid Shino as long as possible. Those bugs were no joke. He swore as he dodged a green-covered leg, the orange leg warmers offending his senses. He needed this round to end sooner rather than later. Sakura dodged Ino's fist and launched her own into the other girl's stomach. Ino danced out of the way, swinging a leg towards her face. Sakura blocked with her forearms before grabbing her leg, throwing her off balance. She didn't even have time to consider grabbing a paint bomb before Ino recovered and launched another attack. Her friendship with Ino was complicated. They had been best friends when they started the academy, the blonde helping and protecting her when Sakura was still dealing with bullies. Then Sasuke had entered the picture, and things kind of just fell apart. Looking back on it now, it was so dumb. Sasuke hadn't cared in the slightest about either of them. While being the prettiest had once held the most prestige in her mind, life after graduation had quickly changed that. The perfume she had cherished would give away her position in the field. Her long hair would be used against her in a taijutsu spar. Her diet would leave her weakened and unable to build muscle. Her delicate dresses offered no protection against ninjutsu. Going on a date with Sasuke would take away from her training time. Everything she had done at the academy with the delusion that it would make Sasuke love her made it harder to be a good kunoichi. Wave had been a wake-up call, and with the guidance of Kinzuya-sensei, she felt like she was finally making progress. Sasuke even spoke to her willingly now. Since she started treating him more as a teammate and less like a trophy, she could honestly say she and the Uchiha were becoming friends. Ryo, too, despite how much they had clashed in the academy. It helped that she now lived with them. It was hard to put Sasuke on a pedestal when she'd seen the boy stuff 27 mini tomatoes in his mouth after a dare from Ryo. Sakura had to admit she'd been horrible, but also looking back, her environment hadn't helped. Getting away from the other girls and civilians had made it easier to change her mindset and attitude. She was still so far behind the others. She was nowhere near as close as the boys were and nowhere near beating them in a fight, but she was miles from where she started. She would catch up one day. She would make sure of it. Hana-sensei had been an amazing if brutal and relentless taskmaster. Sakura was sure her limbs were going to drop off with every day of training. She didn't know she could be so sick of punching a wooden post. She had plans to burn that thing the minute these exams ended. She had gotten stronger, though. She could run further, lift more, train for longer than she could at the beginning of the month. Hana-sensei herself was pure muscle, and while before the idea of Sakura being as thick and muscled as that gave her nightmares, now she could appreciate it. The Inuzuka was strong in a different way than Kinzu-sensei, and Sakura had the thought that if she could become a mix of the two, that would be her ultimate goal. Hana-sensei hadn't made her change much about her outfit. She kept the short, dulled pink sleeveless dress, but instead of separate elbow pads and gloves, she had reinforced black gloves that reached her lower biceps. She wore the same black biker shorts that Hana-sensei favored, and the dress reached beyond them to her knees. It had slits up both sides to allow her to keep her maneuverability, and a thin black belt held it in place at her waist. Black Shinobi boots reached to just below her knees. Her red hete acted as a headband, keeping her short pink hair out of her face. Things had changed with Ino, too. The Yamanaka had noticed that Sakura was changing. She'd even tracked Sakura down not long after Wave to demand if Sakura had given up on Sasuke. When Sakura had answered in the affirmative, Ino's pale blue eyes had widened and she'd taken a step back. She didn't know what they shared without Sasuke in the mix. Sakura wanted her friend back, but she wasn't sure how they were supposed to do that after everything. It had been Sakura's turn to track Ino down only 2 weeks later, when she learned the Yamanaka was purposely avoiding her. A punch, some tears, and a screaming match had resolved most of the awkwardness, and they'd settled into the bickering and jibes from before. It was different this time, though. There was an undertone of warmth and humor that had been absent during the academy. It came from a different place, and it wasn't centered on Sasuke. It was just them. They were slowly getting to a comfortable place, and Sakura didn't have a single doubt that her and Ino would be even closer than they were before. Ino made her better. She was someone she could compete with, test herself against to see if she was really making progress. She didn't have that with Sasuke and Ryo. Ready to give up yet, forehead? Ino snarked, violently shoving some escaped strands of hair out of her face. Getting tired already, Ino pigs? Sakura snapped back even as her heart was light. She caught the quick smile that crossed the Yamanka's face before she raised her block again. Ino's legs slamming into her. Hagain Tenten is out. Sakura could barely glance to see the older girl draped across the Suna Kunoichi's fan nearby when she had to duck another fist from Ino. She lashed out with a hit of her own, managing to clip her jaw. She had no idea how many people were out, how many were left. All that mattered was that she beat Ino. She was grateful that no one had decided to interrupt them. Whoever it was wouldn't have lasted long anyway. They would have been taken down quickly. This was between her and Ino. She narrowed her eyes as Ino palmed a paint bomb, and she quickly brought out one of her own. They were going to finish this. She panted heavily, her limbs heavy. She could feel the sweat running down the back of her neck. They can't have been fighting for very long, but it felt like an eternity. She snapped her arm forward. The ball aimed for the center of Ino's face. It was only at the last second that she realized that Ino had done exactly the same thing. She felt Ino's fist on her cheek, and the bomb exploded. She felt something sticky and wet latch itself to her skin. The impact forced her back, and she slammed down to the ground, dazedly gazing up at the blue sky. Haruno, Sakura, and Yamanaka Ino are out. The words made their way through the haze. Wait, both of them? She hauled herself into a sitting position, looking across to her rival. Ino looked just as surprised as Sakura felt beneath the blue paint that covered her features and dress. Laughter bubbled up in her throat, and she couldn't help but laugh. Whether it was from the image of Ino covered in paint, the fact they'd eliminated each other, or that her chances of making Chunin had just vanished was anyone's guess. That was kind of dumb. She looked over to Shikamaru as he crouched next to them, still pristine. Why aren't you out yet? Ino huffed, trying in vain to scrape some of the paint out of her hair. It's too troublesome to fight, the Nara drawled, and Ino rolled her eyes. It was pretty dumb. Sakura smiled. but I don't think I would have wanted to be beaten by anyone else. Ino's wide eyes darted to her before she also grinned. Same here. Shikamaru looked between the two dubiously before he shook his head, muttering troublesome women beneath his breath. The minute the proctor uttered the word start, Ryo was moving. He wasn't sure where he was moving to yet, but he figured it would decrease his chances of getting hit. He watched Sasuke take down the guy with sunglasses before a noise reached his ears. He backflipped out of the way, the paint bomb soaring past harmlessly. He looked up to see Kiba armed with another one, Akamaru growling behind him. Really, Kiba? Ryo raised an eyebrow. No hard feelings, huh? Kiba's canines peeked through his grin. Ryo stared at him for a moment before he nodded. His best friend seemed dead set on taking him down, and he couldn't disrespect that. Kiba had been his first friend his own age. He was raised with him. They had learned so much together. If something happened when they were younger, Kiba was the first one he told after Nissan and Kazune. He knew Kiba better than he knew himself sometimes. There had been some friction in the academy. Inuzuka were territorial by nature, and that extended to Kiba. He wasn't happy that Ryo had started branching out. It had been just them for so long, and then Tenten, then Shikamaru and Chuji joined them, then Sasuke and Hinata and Shino, and everyone they had met since leaving the academy. Ryo knew that Kiba would always be his first friend, but sometimes the Inuzuka forgot that. It had led to more than one argument between them. Nissan said it was natural to make new friends and drift apart as they grew up, that they would never truly lose each other. Not after being raised together the way they had. Ryo just wished that Kiba could understand that. It wasn't like the Inuzuka wasn't coming round to his place every week or training their tracking skills together in their spare time. Plus, Kiba had his own team to worry about now. He hadn't seen Kiba as much after graduating, and he did feel a little guilty about that. But he didn't feel like he had abandoned his best friend. If Kiba turned up at his door wanting to hang out, Ryo would go without a second thought. It's just that they were busier nowadays. I would have thought you'd go for Sasuke first, he said casually, distracting Kiba from noticing the hand he dipped into his pocket. I'll deal with the pretty boy after I take you out. Kiba tensed slightly. I'm gonna beat you and win this whole thing. Good luck with that. Ryo took a deep breath before he slammed the object he snuck out of his pocket on the ground. The sting bomb clouded their surroundings, and Ryo tore 3 paint bombs from his pouch and launched them in Kiba's direction. There was a tense moment of silence before Hayate's voice rang out. Inuzuka Kiba is out. The cloud began to lift, and Ryo saw an angry Kiba glaring at him. Pink paint had splattered across the front of his jacket. Haruno, Sakura, and Yamanaka Ino are out. Ryo looked over to see his teammate on the ground, yellow paint covering almost her whole head. A blue-covered Ino sat across from her, with a clean Shikamaru crouching beside them. Had Shikamaru taken them both out? That seemed unlikely. Too much effort for the Nara. Hyuga Hinata is out. His head snapped around to see a bloody Hinata slumped to the ground, orange paint covering an entire arm. Alarm shot through him as he saw the state she was in. What happened? That was excessive, especially for this round. He looked over to the boy standing over her, and his eyes narrowed. The male Hyuga's cold and disgusted expression as he stared down at his unconscious clan member led to no misunderstandings. He had done it on purpose. He had hurt Hinata on purpose. Ryo began to stomp his way towards the older boy, determined to take him down for Hinata's sake, when the proctor's voice rang out once again through the stadium. Kankuro of the Sunagakure no Senkyodai is out, the man called, coughing into a closed fist. That concludes the preliminary round. Could all genin please exit the stadium grounds and return to your Jounin sensei in the stands until the tournament round begins? Ryo shot one last glare at the Hyuga before he began to follow the rest of them from the stadium. He looked back at Kiba, but he wasn't looking at him. Distress lined every edge of his frame, and a void appeared in Ryo's gut. He couldn't have been the one to put that look on Kiba's face, could he? Just before they reached the stairs of the stands, Ryo grabbed Kiba's arm and dragged him into one of the corridors that branched off from the main tunnel. The Inuzuka resisted him, but Ryo was determined. He let go once they were out of reasonable earshot of the rest of the group, and he folded his arms. "Kiba, what's wrong?" "Nothing," scoffed Kiba, although he would still not meet Ryo's gaze. "Kiba, it's not nothing," Ryo exclaimed, annoyed, throwing his hands up in frustration. "I know you like the back of my hand. Something has been up with you since we graduated. You still come round and speak to me and stuff, but I can tell there's something there that's not supposed to be." "What did I do?" "Just fucking leave it," Kiba snapped, furious brown eyes finally meeting Ryo's. "I've left it long enough." Ryo glared back at him. "I'm allowed to have other friends, Kiba. You're always going to be my best friend, but just because I'm closer to Sasuke now and Dash at the mention of the Uchiha's name," Kiba visibly recoiled and Ryo sighed in annoyance. "Are you still on this jealousy thing?" "You don't get it. Because Kiba, I don't give a shit if you Inuzuka are territorial or whatever, Dash. You don't understand." "Then explain it to Mu Epsilon." "You're leaving me behind." Ryo scoffed. "I just said that we're still going to be friends even if we find other friends, Dash." "That's not what I mean." Kiba gripped his hair, his knuckles turning white. "You're getting way stronger than me and I can't catch up. You would rather hang out with Sasuke because he's closer to your level." "Kiba," Ryo said quietly, shock coursing through his system. "Look at today." Kiba flung a hand out desperately. "You beat me in seconds. I'm supposed to give you a fight, maybe even beat you sometimes. You were always better than me at the academy. You had Naruto and and Kanzui there to train you. Then you got Sasuke, the best in our whole year. How am I supposed to compete?" Kiba panted harshly, and Ryo could only stare at him. This is what had been bothering his friend. It wasn't that he was making new friends. It was that they were better than him. Ryo was better than him. He felt like he couldn't keep up. He hadn't even realized he'd swung his fist until he was looking down at Kiba, his fist throbbing slightly. "You are the biggest moron I have ever met." Kiba's face dropped before Ryo continued. "Whatever made you think that we can only be friends if we're both strong?" Ryo asked, his voice rising with every question. "When have we ever based our friendship on who is better? You're my best friend, Kiba, not because you can kick my ass, but because of who you are. It doesn't matter how many matches we win, how many jutsu we learn, what rank we are. We are supposed to be friends." He continued ranting, not even looking at his friend now. "Sure, we can be competitive, but since when is that the measure of how we're supposed to be friends? I could lose my limbs and become a civilian. Does that mean we're not friends? You could make Jounin before me. Does that mean we're not friends? You need to stop measuring our friendship by dumb shit. Isn't it enough that I like hanging out with you, laughing with you, training with you?" He pointed a finger right in Kiba's face. "By your logic, we can't be friends because you are way better at tracking than me and are friends with Shino, who is also amazing at tracking. Don't you hear how dumb that is?" The normally loud and boisterous Inuzuka was silent, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. Akamaru nudged his elbow, and Kiba looked down to the puppy, rubbing his head gently as he relaxed. He reached out and grabbed the hand that Ryo had kept held out for him. "When you put it like that," he said sheepishly, "we are not done talking about this." Ryo hissed even as he pulled his friend into a tight hug. Kiba froze for a long moment before he slumped, wrapping his own arms around Ryo. "You're stuck with me, understood?" Ryo said quietly into his ear. "I'll drag you with me if I have to. We're going to be friends until we one day get taken out in a blaze of glory, when we're so old we can't shit by ourselves." "Got it." Kiba huffed a laugh into his shoulder, nodding. "Got it." The round had not lasted long, and Hiruzen was pleased by the result. While not all, the majority of the finalists were from Konoha, and they had earned their places in the tournament. They would quickly clean up the field of paint and give the genin a chance to catch their breath. The board with the matchups was already set up, and he knew that the finalists' names were being added to the system at this very moment. There was a good mix of teams, too. No one team had all their members make it through. There was movement to his left, and the Kazekage entered the viewing pavilion. Raza was dressed in the customary green, and white robes associated with the office. His tan features were shadowed beneath the brim of the Kazakage's hat, and his dark red hair only peeked out slightly. Dark eyes scanned the field as he took his seat beside Hiruzen. "Razadano, welcome." Hiruzen nodded his head towards the other village leader. "Hiruzen Dano." The man greeted back, settling himself down. "You missed the preliminary round." Hiruzen commented lightly, although there was an undertone of question. "Something came up at the last moment that delayed my arrival," Raza answered casually. "It was dealt with swiftly, and I was able to make my way here." Hiruzen raised an eyebrow, but he did not ask on the topic further, sensing the man was not finished. "However, I do not find it a great loss," he continued. "I had no desire to watch the weak being weeded out. I want to watch my son crush the strong genin of your village." Hiruzen sighed. "I think you may find yourself surprised, Razadano," he said, keeping his voice neutral. "We may have a few surprises for you this year." He stood before the man could reply and approached the edge of the balcony, applying the same amplifying jutsu as earlier. "This concludes the preliminary round." His voice echoed over the stands. "We will now proceed with the tournament round. The names of the genin have been randomized, and the first 4 matches will be shown on the board. I wish the competitors the best of luck." He settled back into his seat to watch the first match, missing the glint of yellow that appeared in the eyes of the Kazakage for only a brief moment. Kakashi stood proudly in the stands, waiting for his team to make their way back to him. It was a pity about Sakura, but he could see how much she'd improved under Hana. She was miles away from where was in the bell test, and he felt the pride singing in his chest. He was glad he had his mask, or the other sensei might comment on the beaming smile he was sure was plastered across his face. He turned a smug gaze towards his fellow jounin, and he was sure they could see it in his eye. "Shut the fuck up, Kakashi," grumbled Asuma, blowing a cloud of smoke into his face. Asuma, I don't recall saying anything," Kakashi sniped back. They were interrupted by an exuberant guy bouncing his way into their group. "Such a beautiful display of youth," he sobbed. "Our genin are a shining example to us all about how we must push past our limits and embrace the springtime of our youth. Your genin was exemplary to avoid Lee's onslaught for so long." Kakashi looked away the moment glistening dark eyes turned to him. "Did you say something, Guy?" "So hip, Kakashi." The tears only fell harder. "Guy Sensei." "Lee." The matching pair ran into each other's arms, the sobbing intensifying. A Hyuga stood nearby supporting a girl, his face resigned. "Kaka-sensei." A paint-covered Sakura walked over to him, and he patted her head gently. "You did good," he said gently. "You're a lot stronger now." Sakura nodded even as she wiped away some errant tears. Sasuke stood beside her, and Kakashi didn't hesitate to firmly ruffle the uchiha's clean hair. "Well done, Sasuke. You used all your training to its full potential." Sasuke batted away his hand, trying to pat his hair back into the mess it was before. He didn't say anything, but Kakashi knew him well enough by now. The kid was pleased. He looked behind him, but there was no sign of the third. "Where's Ryo?" "He and Kiba went somewhere after the match." Sakura shrugged. Kakashi was about to ask her to elaborate when his final student turned up. "Kashi-sensei." Ryo's blonde hair was easy to spot as it bounced towards them. Like Sasuke, he was paint-free and would be moving on to the tournament. He had 2 genin moving on, one more than the other 2 rookie genin teams. He knew he couldn't take all the credit. Hana and Gunma had done an amazing job training Sakura and Ryo during the month break, and he knew Naruto and Kazuya had a large hand in all of their lives. He compared his team to what they had been 6 months ago, and he was so grateful to Naruto for giving him the kick up the ass to really start training them properly. He didn't know why he'd been so nervous. They had taken to the harder training like ducks to water, and even Sakura had been putting in extra hours. He couldn't wait to see what they would become. He hadn't given them enough credit. Ryo greeted his teammates with a high five, coercing one out of Kakashi after he broke out the puppy dog eyes. His bright violet eyes darted around, his shoulders sagging as he failed to find what he'd been looking for. Where's Nissan? Kakashi hadn't seen the redhead, but he hadn't thought much of it. He might have been late to leave Kinzuya, since he still stuck to his bed, Kakashi offered. He also wouldn't be in this area. It's for competing genin and their sensei. He's probably further up in the stands or behind the scenes somewhere. He wouldn't miss this for the world. Yeah, you're probably right. Ryo nodded, although he still looked unsure. That was normal. Naruto had been kidnapped. It had only been a month ago, so it was sure to still be fresh. Naruto wasn't in the middle of Fire Country this time, though. He was in Konoha. Konoha was supposed to be safe. Chapter 35. 3, 2, 1. Fight. Sasuke was distracted from Kakashi-sensei and Ryo's conversation by Hayade's announcement. Please see the board for the matchups. Sasuke looked up to the board to find his name at the very top. Uchiha Sasuke, Konoha. Aburame Shino, Konoha. Nara Shikamaru, Konoha. Temari of the Sunagekure no Senkidai Suna. Uzumaki Norio, Konoha. Hyuga Niji, Konoha. Gaara of the Sunagekure no Senkidai Suna. Rock Lee, Konoha. His gaze moved to find the quiet boy, quickly finding him next to his sensei. He didn't talk to Shino much, had only ever hung around him when their teams were together. He knew that he had the chakra-eating bugs, and that he was more tactical than their peers. He hadn't been far behind Sasuke in the academy rankings. You got this, Sasuke. Ryo grinned, nudging his arm. He raised an eyebrow at the blonde. Yeah, I know I don't need to tell you that. Ryo's smile turned sharp. Kick his ass? Sasuke granted him a nod before he left, Sakura echoing of good luck behind him. Kakashi-sensei hadn't said anything, but he didn't need to. Sasuke knew what he had to do. He made his way across the balcony to descend the stairs, entering the short, dark tunnel before emerging back into the bright afternoon light. Shino had moved into position across from him, and Sasuke watched his opponent carefully, strategy after strategy racing through his mind. This would have to be kept long range. His taijutsu was better than Shino's, but those bugs were the main threat. He might not be able to beat Shino before they drained his chakra, so he would do it the long way. He wasn't sure what Shino had in terms of long-range jutsu, but Kakashi-sensei had been working on their ability to dodge a while before the exams, so he was confident he'd be able to cope with anything Shino threw his way. He had a few in his own arsenal. Shino may be good, but Sasuke was better. The proctor looked between them, smothering a cough into his elbow. Hey raised his hand, bringing it down quickly and jumping out of the way. Begin! Sasuke immediately flipped through hand seals, inhaling deeply. Ketan, Gokaki no Jutsu. He launched the fireball towards his opponent, standing his ground as the ball crashed straight into Shino. He narrowed his eyes as the earth clone crumbled to the ground. So he was earth-natured. He would need to switch tactics. His Sharingan allowed him a crystal-clear view of the area, and he began to move as his gaze landed on a disturbed area of the arena. Right on Jibashi. The lightning moved through the floor, ripping up small chunks of earth as it traveled. Shino launched himself out of the ground just before it reached him and bounded closer. He overhead the Aburame and cursed beneath his breath. Doton, Kajuno Doro. Wet slabs of dirt rose from the ground around him and latched onto his limbs. Sasuke tugged on his arm, but it refused to budge. He grit his teeth as he watched a few of the bugs start to latch onto his exposed skin, feeling the small drain of his chakra. Of course, Shino would learn techniques that would allow him to capture his enemies. What better way to complement his Kakechu? He didn't have the chance to use hand seals, so he would have to come up with something else. There had to be something. He groaned as he found a solution. Kakashi-sensei was never going to let him hear the end of this. He closed his eyes and focused on his chakra, calming his breathing as the sounds around him faded away. He slowly began to convert his chakra to lightning, the buzzing feeling sitting around his navel. He could feel more and more of his chakra drain away, and he knew he had to do this now. His red eyes snapped open, and he unleashed the converted chakra through his tenketsu. There was a bright flash as he lit up like a lantern, the arcs of electricity traveling rapidly over his limbs and dissolving the mud. It slopped to the ground to cover the many dead kakashi that were still faintly smoking. Sasuke had to take a moment to collect himself, his entire being burned. He silently vowed never to do that again as he tried to shove the pain to the back of his mind. Right on Ryzen, he launched the projectile at the Abdurrahim, just wanting the match over with. Shino managed to dodge, but Sasuke had followed in its path, drawing near his opponent for the first time since the match had started only a few minutes ago. Right-un. Takuru no right-un. Sasuke body slammed into Shino, taking him down the floor with him. He canceled the technique as he sat on top of his opponent, grabbing his arms and holding him immobile. The proctor walked over to them, peering over Sasuke's shoulder. Abdurrahim Shino, can you continue? Shino remained quiet for a long moment before he shook his head slowly. Sasuke let him go and rose to his feet. Abdurrahim Shino is unable to continue. Uchiha Sasuke is through to the next round. Sasuke sighed heavily as his shoulders slumped. That was a lot harder than he'd been expecting. He knew he couldn't lose here, not with Itachi still out there, but it proved that he still had a long way to go. He held out a hand for Shino and hauled him to his feet, his arms protesting the movement. They both began to walk to the tunnel in silence. It was just before they separated to their respective teams that Sasuke spoke up. Good match, Sasuke murmured under his breath. You too. Sasuke walked up to his team and avoided looking at Kakashi-sensei's knowing gaze. That was amazing, Sasuke. Ryo bounced over to him, vibrating with excitement. The way you were like a living lightning rod, which was so cool by the way. Your ninjutsu is insane. Sasuke rolled his eyes fondly. Sasuke, I can heal you before your next match. He looked over into Sakura's steady gaze, her green eyes calm and earnest. Kazuya-sensei taught some more advanced first aid, she continued. It's not much, but I can take away some of the strain. Sasuke hesitated for only a second before he held his arm out, only now noticing the small soot-like marks near each one of his tenketsu. He felt another hand on his shoulder, and he looked up at Kakashi-sensei. It was brilliant of you to use our chakra molding exercises like that, but please never do it again, his teacher said firmly. You could do some serious damage if you did that more than once. Sasuke nodded. When Kakashi had made him sit down and learn to mold his regular chakra into lightning chakra, before he was allowed to learn a right-on jutsu, Sasuke had complained. He didn't need to do it to learn jutsu. After that match, he now found himself appreciating those hours spent sitting in the training ground. Nara, Shikamaru, and Temari of the Sunagakure no Senkyudai, please cough. Please make your way to the arena. Sasuke turned to watch his arm still held in Sakura's grasp. Whoever won this match would be his next opponent. Ryo tapped his foot impatiently as he watched his friend dance around the Sunanin. It was his match next, and he had a bone to pick with his opponent. He hadn't forgotten how Niji had treated Hinata in the preliminary round, and he wasn't about to let something like that slide. She's a wind user. He heard Sasuke mutter beneath his breath as Temari unleashed another wave of cutting wind at Shikamaru's head. Yeah, you should probably use your fire rather than lightning. She might try to turn my fire against me, and projectiles won't work. His friend nodded. I'll need to get close. They watched as Shikamaru continued to dodge and hide. Ryo wasn't worried. Shikamaru was the smartest person he'd ever met. He had a plan. Those thoughts dissolved as he watched in outrage as Shikamaru forfeited after capturing Temari's shadow. Ryo launched himself forward, only prevented from tumbling over the railing by Kashi grabbing his collar. Shikamaru, what the fuck? He yelled down at his friend who was pointedly not looking his way. You had her. Ryo grumbled as he took a step back and shook off his teacher. He would make Shikamaru regret giving up. His friend could think circles around every single person in the stadium. He just refused to apply himself. It was such a waste. What would happen out in the field if he slacked off now? As Shikamaru joined them on the dais, Ryo watched a shudder run through his thin frame as he caught Ryo's glare. Uzumaki cough. Norio and Hyuga Niji, please make, cough cough, your way to the arena Ryo looked down to the proctor and hopped over the railing, ignoring Kashi's exasperated admonishment behind him. He used his chakra on the wall to control his descent. He walked to stand near Hade and glared at the older Hyuga as he took his place opposite. He shared some resemblance to Hinata in his features. Long, straight brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and a thick black headband covered his forehead. A thick beige, sleeveless jacket and black shorts covered his lean frame. His features were delicate, just like Hinata's, but his eyes and hair were slightly darker. He also didn't have the openness and kindness that he always associated with Hinata. His gaze was hard and cold. "You look like you want to say something," Niji commented in a dull tone. "I am going to kick your ass," Ryo snapped back, his earlier fury rising up once again. Niji settled back into his hip, the blood vessels around his eyes bulging, as a pupil appeared in his pale purple eyes. "I look forward to your look of disappointment," he said calmly. "We both know what fate has intended for this fight." Ryo resisted the urge to tell him where he could shove his fate, and fell into his own ready position. He recalled what Genma-sensei had told him about the Hyuga clan. Long distance was always better. Their taijutsu style relied on close contact, so it was better to get some distance and fight with his long-range jutsu. Ryo understood even if he didn't like it. He really wanted to punch this guy in the face. Have 8 raise his hand, drawing it rapidly. "Begin!" Ryo let loose a barrage of kunai as he flung himself back, his spring backflip getting him some distance. He scowled as he watched Niji snatch one of the kunai, using it to block the others. He flipped through hand seals rapidly as Niji took a step forward. Suiden no jutsu. The barrage of water left his mouth and went straight for Niji. He couldn't see it hit the Hyuga, but he would have been hard-pressed to avoid it entirely. He cut the technique as a fist swung at him, and he ducked. A very wet and angry Niji swung again, and Ryo blocked. Feeling the harsh jolt, he narrowed his eyes. Fuck this long-distance thing. He was going to beat this guy with his own fists. He swung a fist of his own, and they exchanged blows. None landing, but he could feel the air shift as they came close. The breath was driven from his lungs as Niji managed to slam an open palm into his sternum, shoving him back several paces. He rolled with the force and rose to his feet, flipping through more hand seals. He wanted to use the jutsus Zabuza used to hide back and wave, but there just wasn't enough water. Suiden, Mizu Shuriken. Small projectiles launched towards Niji. He huffed as the Hyuga avoided them, getting closer once again. "You understand, right?" Niji said firmly. "You have no way of winning." Ryo rolled his eyes and launched another attack. They exchanged blows and Ryo growled, as Niji narrowly avoided his kick to the chin. The other boy was fast. "What happened to beating me?" Niji commented, and Ryo riled at the condescending tone. "Not only am I going to beat you, I'm going to make you apologize to Hinata." Niji dodged around the flurry of punches that Ryo unleashed. Hinata? That pitiful example of the main branch. Ryo saw red, and he didn't think about strategy. He lashed out, and Niji took a few steps back with a burst lip. The Hyuga wiped away the blood with a harsh swipe, spreading it over his left cheek. "I'm going to be the Hokage," Ryo yelled. "I'm not going to let anyone talk about my friends that way." "The Hokage. You are going to become the Hokage," Niji scoffed. "At your level, it's impossible." Ryo clenched his fists. Ryo glared as his hand began to shake. Niji was wrong. Ryo would become the Hokage. He knew he could. He would protect everyone. Even with Uzumaki-sama and Arai-sensei, you are not meant for such great heights. That is not your destiny. I make my own destiny. Niji just looked at him. This match is over. Ryo's eyes widened as Niji began to gear up for something. 8 trigrams, 2 palms. Ryo scrambled, but he wasn't fast enough to avoid the strikes. The blows landed heavily on his torso, and he called out in pain. The hits kept coming, and he didn't have time to raise a block or a defense. 64 palms. The last strikes threw Ryo across the arena, and he hit the ground hard. skidding back before finally rolling to a stop. Are you frustrated? Kneeling down before a power that can't be changed and to know your own powerlessness. Rio gritted his teeth as he rose to his feet, his knees almost buckling halfway up. He heard a quiet "no way" from Niji, and he grinned. I just don't know when to give up, you know? He bared his teeth at the Hyuga. I got that from my brothers. Just stop already, Niji insisted. The result will be the same no matter how much you fight. I will not stop until you admit defeat. All this over Hinata? Do you know of the destiny of the Hyuga, our destiny of hatred? He ripped off his headband, exposing his forehead and the green seal that was etched into pale skin. Hinata's father was born first in the head family of the Hyuga, leaving my father to be shoved aside into the branch family. As his son, I was branded with the curse mark and became a bird in a cage. It serves not just as a status symbol, but to keep me in line, to make sure that I know my place. Rio swallowed down the horror at the implications. My father was killed by the head family. Hinata's father killed the head of the Kumo peace delegation, and so Kumo demanded payment. They demanded the body of the Hyuga clan head, and instead of handing over Hayashi-sama, they killed my father as a replacement. Niji looked up from the ground to stare directly into Rio's eyes. Other than dying, there's no other way to escape the curse mark. Even though they were twins with nearly equal power, the order in which they were born decided their entire lives. When you were drawn as my opponent, your destiny was decided too. Your destiny is to lose to me. Niji retied the hitayate around his forehead, covering the curse mark once again. That sounds like it sucks, Rio said sincerely. I'm sorry that happened to you and your dad. Niji looked back at him in surprise, but Rio continued. Being stuck with a burden, with something that's not your fault, it doesn't have to define you. You don't have to let it control you. People can be shitty about it, but that doesn't mean you can be shitty to other people because of it. That makes you part of the problem. Rio knew that better than anyone. He'd been lucky with Nissan and Kazune. They'd provided a shield for most of the villagers' hate. He hadn't even been aware of it before Nissan had been admitted to the hospital back when Nissan had been in the academy. He had lashed out a bit before he went to the academy, but Nissan had sat him down a short while after he'd found out about the Kyubi and straightened him out. People are born burdened with an inherent destiny that they cannot defy. You think you're the only one with a shit hand. Rio screamed back at him. Wake up. Everyone has a burden. Everyone has suffered. You can't dictate to people and pull them down just because you think you got it worse. Niji looked taken aback, but Rio thundered on. Besides, you're being a total hypocrite. You're saying I can't change and Hinata can't change, but you're trying to change yourself. There's no way you came up with such an awesome technique by just settling for what you have. You're trying to change destiny too. Niji paused before he straightened up. Then prove it. Beat me. Rio grinned, but internally he was frantically trying to come up with a plan. It felt like he had chakra exhaustion. How did he unlock his tenketsu? Sasuke used his tenketsu to spread lightning chakra, but he didn't have any chakra to do that. A terrible idea crossed his mind. It was a terrible, no good, dangerous idea, but it was all he had. He closed his eyes and searched his core, trying to find that foreign molten source of chakra that he always felt in the back of his mind. He brought his hands together in front of him into a head seal. Kyubi, help me out, please. He felt something click and warmth flowed through him, to the tips of his fingers and toes. Something loosened in his skin and he felt his tenketsu open back up, and his regular chakra began to flow normally. The warm chakra faded and Rio threw a quiet thank you into the abyss. There was no answer. What was that? Niji demanded. My burden, Rio answered. He launched himself towards the Hyuga, their kunai clashing between them. Rio stood his ground as he poured chakra into the blade and pushed harder when Niji did the same. It reached a peak and Rio felt a force throwing him back, dust and debris circling around him. The breath was driven from his lungs as he landed on the hard ground. He hauled himself up and looked for Niji, launching himself forward again and landing a hit under the bottom of Niji's chin just as the Hyuga managed to get to his feet. He stood over the Hyuga as he lay on the ground. "Hyuga Niji, can you continue?" There was a long pause. "No." Hyuga Niji is unable to continue. Uzumaki Norio moves on to the next round. Ryo just continued to look down at his beaten opponent. "Sure, you can't change the hand you're dealt," he said quietly. "But once you get that hand, it's all up to you. Fuck destiny. How do you want to live your life?" Niji didn't answer, but Ryo could see the conflict on his face. "I'll talk to my brother about the curse mark," Ryo offered. "It sounds wrong and it shouldn't be forced on anyone. He'll know a way to undo it. He's kind of a genius with seals." He would shoot off the field before Niji could reply, but he hoped things got better for Niji. He was still going to make him apologize to Hinata, though. The Kazekage was leaning forward in his seat, his dark eyes trained on the blonde genin, making his way out of the arena. Hiruzen wasn't sure he liked that look in his eyes. "You have some interesting genin this year, Hiruzen Dano." Raza finally leaned back into his seat as the area was cleared for the next match. "I could say the same of you, Raza Dano," he replied mildly. "Two of your children made it through to the final matches, and your daughter has fairly mastered wind techniques. You must be proud." The Kazekage smiled, but there was no warmth or pride behind it. "Yes, I suppose so." Hiruzen left it at that as the next matchup was announced. Ryo was once again leaning over the railing. Sakura had given him a quick once-over after the match, but he'd always healed fast anyway. He'd be ready to go by the time his next match came around. "Gaara of the Sunagakure no Senkyodai and Rock Lee, please make your way, cough, to the arena." Sasuke came to lean beside him as the two very different genin moved towards the proctor. Gaara was slow and calm, his steps measured and his face black, while he had already made it there, bouncing on the toes of his feet and grin, so wide it almost split his face. "You fought with Lee during the preliminaries, right?" Ryo muttered over his shoulder to his friend. "Yeah," Sasuke quietly replied, his eyes still trained on the pair in the arena. Ryo rolled his eyes as he nudged the Uchiha's shoulder. Sasuke threw an annoyed look right back at him. "Well, he's fast," he offered, his activated Sharingan already back on the other genin. "And strong. Begin." Ryo whipped his head back round to catch Green Blur already dashing towards the stationary Sunanin. Lee jumped and spun, swinging a kick directly to Gaara's face. "Konoha Senpu." A wave of sand burst out from Gaara's gourd to block the attack, almost swallowing Lee's leg in the process. The Konoha genin managed to jump back, but the sand just kept on coming, soon forming a wall between the genin. It chased Lee back against the wall before retreating back into the gourd. Gaara hadn't moved an inch. Lee darted forward once again and tried to land a blow, but for every kick and punch, sand was always there to block it. A large wave crashed down into the spot where Lee had just been, but he'd moved in time. Lee looked back to where Gaara had been standing for the whole match so far, but he was gone. "You know, Naruto changed Gaara more than I think he'll ever know." Ryo jumped slightly at the voice behind him and turned around to stare at Temari. She was smiling softly down at her brother. Before, Gaara would never have moved. He would always do everything from one spot and expect his sand to take care of everything. Now he's willing to learn other things and improve himself in ways that don't involve his sand. Ryo looked back down at Gaara, who had reappeared on the other side of the stadium. He'd vowed to learn more about his brother when he'd first met the Sand siblings before the exams. They'd made him realize that he didn't know as much as he should have about Nissan. He took him for granted, and that it never had been as apparent as when he learned that Nissan had been kidnapped. He knew Nissan was amazing, but was there something about him that could change people so profoundly? Did Ryo just miss it because he's always been around Nissan? What did Nissan actually do at work? How do so many people know who he is? He hadn't had a chance yet to sit down and talk without anyone around since Nissan had turned up in the forest. He got discharged today, so he was watching in the crowd somewhere. Ryo would win this whole thing and make him proud, and then after he makes Chunin, he will talk to Nissan. He'll be a better brother. He winced as a whip of sand grabbed a hold of Lee's ankle and started to slam him against the concrete surfaces. He looked over as Tenten joined him at the railing on the opposite side of Sasuke. "Lee is really strong," she commented. "He can't use ninjutsu or genjutsu, but his taijutsu is one of the best I've ever seen." "That might not be enough against Gaara," he replied quietly as the sand finally let go of Lee. The older boy landed heavily, creating a crater beneath him. Ryo watched as he picked himself back up and tried again. Punches and kicks and spins one after another to no effect. Lee finally slipped on the sand beneath his feet and hit the ground again. The sand elapsed over him, and he felt Tenten tense up beside him. Lee managed to dodge, and he landed on top of the hand statue that rested against one wall. "Lee!" "Drop them." All eyes turned to Guy. "You told me only to do that to protect a large group of very important people." Lee yelled back. "That's quite all right." Guy grinned, winking with enthusiastic thumbs up. "I give you permission." Ryo narrowed his eyes as Lee took out something from beneath his orange leg warmers. Were those weights? That wasn't going to do much. What was his plan? He choked as they hit the ground, leaving 2 deep craters and a massive plume of smoke from where they had landed. Tenten patted his back gently, but he could see the smug grin plastered over her face. Sasuke hadn't flinched, but Ryo could see that his grip on the railing had tightened. Lee vanished, and suddenly he was circling Gaara quicker than Ryo could keep track of. "Sasuke, what's happening?" His attacks are getting closer to hitting him. One such punch landed, and Gaara went flying. He heard Temari's gasp, even though she'd moved much further along the railing. Gaara pulled himself to his feet, and the sand began pouring out of the gourd at an alarming rate. It soon covered the entire floor of the area and climbed up the walls, and no matter how much Lee jumped and flipped, he couldn't avoid the wave forever. It finally caught the edge of his arm, and the sand began to envelop him, quickly covering the green spandex. Lee's fists appeared as the onslaught continued, but eventually the only thing visible left was his face. "Lee, can you continue?" The boy struggled, but no matter how strong he was, it was hard to fight something he couldn't get a grip on. The proctor watched him struggle for a few more moments before raising his hand. Rock Lee is unable to continue. Gaara moves on to the next round. Gaara gently retracted the sand from around the struggling Konoha genin, and it flowed back into the gourd on his back. He walked up to a frozen Lee and held out a hand, waiting patiently. The older genin paused for only a moment before he grasped a limb and shook it up and down far more enthusiastically than Gaara probably expected. Sasuke shifted next to him, and Ryo nudged his shoulder in support. He had this. Temari was so going down. Sasuke shook out his arms as he emerged from the tunnel. Sakura had managed to take away some of the strain from the previous match, and while he still felt a bit achy, he was in a much better position than he would have been otherwise. It had taken a while to trust that she wouldn't go all fangirl on him. She'd really changed since their time in the academy. It was a relief just to be left alone, but she was becoming someone he could actually rely on. Kanzuya had made a huge difference, and Hana was the best role model he could think of for her. Since she'd moved into a spare room, they'd reached a truce of sorts. They generally left each other alone, but they could find some common ground in dealing with the Uzumaki clan. Sasuke had many years of practice with the playful and chaotic nature of the family. It was entertaining to watch Sakura deal with it for a change. She hadn't even been ambushed with one of their training exercises yet. He stopped next to Hei and watched Temari land opposite him, having used her fan to float herself down from the stands. She was an expert in futon, so his right arm was out. His keton was strong, but he'd have to be careful. He eyed the massive fan in her hands. If he set that on fire, he'd win easily. He ignored the voice in the back of his mind that sounded suspiciously like Ryo whispering pyro. It wasn't his fault most plans worked better with fire. Begin. Keton. Hozenka no Jutsu. He unleashed a barrage of shots. The small orbs of fire aimed right for Temari. She grinned and swept her fan. Senpago Hiki. The wave of air crashed into his own technique. catching fire and forming a massive wall of flame. It also changed the direction of his technique, and he cursed, rushing through hand seals. Doton, Mogurukure no Jutsu. He dove into the ground, the dirt moving around him to allow him to sink unhindered. He caught his breath in his tiny pocket. He had to get close. The dark walls around him blocked out the sounds of the crowd, and he took a moment to relish the peace of the moment. He understood why Kakashi-sensei liked this technique. Closing his eyes, he waited as he felt Temari move above him. She stopped moving, and he crept closer. Moving to just beneath the surface, he whispered, "Kitan, Injiki." He took a big gulp of air before the technique swallowed all the oxygen in the tiny space. Breaking through the thin crust of earth above him, he swung for Temari, catching the edge of her fan. She quickly retreated, managing to pat out the budding flame. But Sasuke didn't give her a chance to release another of her attacks. He pounced forward, his fist still on fire, and engaged her in taijutsu. She blocked each of his hits with her fan to avoid the burns, but Sasuke grinned viciously as he saw the increasing damage to her fan. "Surrender," he said quietly, his face close to hers as she blocked another hit. "Go fuck yourself, Uchiha," she spat back as she managed to bury her fan deep in his gut. His flame spluttered out in his surprise, and Temari managed to get some distance, swinging what was left of her fan. It wasn't as strong as before, but it was enough to force him back a few steps. The wind sliced into his clothing and drew blood, the liquid warm on his skin as it left a trail before dropping to the floor. Sasuke watched her for a moment, his Sharingan catching all of her subtle movements. He couldn't copy her techniques. They required a fan, and futon was the hardest for him to learn. He had weakened her fan to the point where she couldn't make any big moves. He smirked as she tried not to obviously favor her left leg. He thought he'd managed to graze a limb earlier. This would play into his hands. He ran forward as fast as his legs could push him, and while the Sunanin was fast, she was no Kakashi-sensei. He slammed a leg into her fan, forcing it down before he lashed out. She dodged around his fist and lifted her fan once again. He grinned and twirled in a roundhouse kick, aiming for her unprotected legs. He got a direct hit on her injury, and she was forced to her knees with a grunt. "Katan, Injiki." He placed both hands on her fan and watched as it destroyed the rest of the beige fabric until all that was left was a charred frame. He leaned over her, pushing the wood in her stomach to keep her pinned. Hade appeared over his shoulder, muffling a cough into his elbow. "Temari, can you continue?" She struggled beneath his hold, but Sasuke did not give an inch. He was starting to really feel his own injuries from the fight, and he didn't want to get any more. He still had another match. Hade watched for a moment before he raised a hand. Temari of the Sunagakure no Senkyodai is unable to continue. Uchiha Sasuke moved on to the next round. Sasuke let go amidst the thundering applause, his chest hurting with each breath. She might have nailed some of his ribs earlier. She rushed to her feet, brushing herself off, and stalked off. Sasuke quickly followed her into the tunnel. "What are you following me?" Temari snapped, whirling around in the middle of the corridor. "You won. Isn't that enough for you?" Sasuke watched her quietly for a long moment. "That was a good match," he said calmly. "You're the strongest genin I've fought so far." She stopped short as she scrutinized his face. He was sure she was searching for an ulterior motive, but he meant what he said. She was incredibly strong. Opponents like her were what he wanted. They would help him get stronger. She scoffed, but a lot of the anger was gone. "Easy for you to say." She rolled her eyes, turning and continuing to walk away. "I don't know many genin who can use 3 different elemental jutsu." Sasuke walked after her, shoving his hands in his pockets with a wince. "Gaara is going to beat you," Temari said with confidence as they began climbing the stairs. "He has to beat Ryo first," Sasuke retorted. "Gaara's only ever lost once," she said back, but there was a smile at the edge of her lips. He learned his lesson. Sasuke rolled his own eyes, but there was no malice behind it. Temari was strong and she had his respect. He couldn't imagine her brother was any different. Ryo bounced down the stairs, coaxing a high five out of Sasuke on his way past. That fight was amazing. Kakashi had apparently taught Sasuke a lot more than speed during their month of training. He couldn't wait to fight his friend in the final. He just had to beat Gaara first. His opponent was very dependent on his sand, and that could work for Ryo. He had a few water techniques up his sleeve. It would have been better if there was a water source nearby, but he could make do. They would have to make him a Chunin if he made it to the final. He could follow in Nissan's footsteps by becoming a Chunin as a rookie. He finally emerged from the tunnel, back into the bright lights and sounds that he'd grown accustomed to over the course of the day. He grinned widely at Gaara, who was already standing next to Hade. "Let's have a great match, Gaara." Gaara nodded, and Ryo fell back into his ready stance. During the day they'd first arrived, when they'd given the Suna team a tour around Konoha, he'd learned a little bit about his fellow Jinchuriki. Gaara was quiet and reserved. He kept things close to his chest. Ryo had managed to pick up on his interest in flowers and botany. They almost hadn't been able to drag the boy back out of Yamanaka flowers. He'd also picked up on the fact that Gaara's life hadn't been quite as happy and protected as Ryo's had been. He hadn't asked, but he wanted to know what the other boy had been through, what Ryo had escaped. The villagers had taken until he was in the academy to warm up to him, but they had never tried to harm him. He kind of wanted to know how much Nissan had protected him from. Hade looked between them before raising his hand. As he was about to lower his hand and start the match, white feathers began to fall from the sky. Ryo felt tiredness creep into the edge of his mind, and he frowned. That didn't feel right. Kai! The exhaustion vanished, and the sense of wrong only grew stronger. He looked up into the stadium, and his eyes widened at the sight of rows and rows of sleeping civilians. Kakashi and the other Jounin were fighting off Shinobi dressed completely in black. He took a step back as Temari and Kankuro appeared next to Gaara, their eyes wide in fear. "Please tell me he didn't," Temari whispered. "We have to get Gaara out of here." Kankuro swallowed hard. "Wait! No! What the fuck is going on?" Ryo regained himself and took a step forward. "I think I would like to hear this myself," Hade said next to them, sounding more serious than he'd been all day. "My father mentioned an invasion before we arrived in Konoha," Temari admitted. He wanted Gaara to lose control during one of the final matches, to provide a distraction and the start signal. But he said no. Kankuro added desperately, "We all did. Gaara can't even lose control anymore thanks to Naruto's seal." "We thought that he'd stop or lose interest," Temari insisted. "Gaara was a big part of the plan, and without him, Suna doesn't have the power or numbers to do anything. Why didn't you say anything?" Ryo yelled. The rest of the genin from the exam landed on the arena ground from their place in the stands. Sasuke led them over to him, watching the Suna trio with suspicious red eyes. "The sensei sent us over here," he explained quietly. "They're fighting off some shinobi that attacked us. We didn't know. Nobody said anything after that. We didn't think he would go through with it." Temari shouted back, her hand tightening on Gaara's shoulder. "I promise we would have tried to stop it. I would never do anything to hurt Naruto." All eyes were drawn to Gaara. That applies to his village and comrades. Tusen has always had a grudge against Konoha, Kankuro grimaced. "I don't know why he would do this. Kazaka-sama didn't do this." Ryo's breath caught in his throat as Nissan appeared next to Hade in a swirl of leaves. He stood a bit taller than the other man, and his long red hair was tied back into a high bun. Dressed in his usual shinobi gear of black trousers, sandals, and a sleeveless crop top, with his brace covering his left arm and a bracer to his elbow on his right, he cut an intimidating figure. The tattoos on his ribs and stomach were on display, and his tight was wrapped around his brace. Intense blue eyes swept over the stadium before landing on the trio of Suna genin. "Your father was never here," Nissan continued. "Orochimaru most likely killed him and disguised as him to get close to Hokage-sama. He probably misled your fellow shinobi. When ordered by their Kage, they wouldn't have had a choice but to follow his orders. Ryo followed Nisan's gaze to see a translucent blue barrier rise over the stand Hokage and Kazekage had been sitting in. Hokage-sama will have to handle him, Nisan dismissed as he turned back to the genin. Gaara, Temari, Kankuro, you need to get out of here. Go back to Suna and report to your council about what's happening here. Kankuro nodded and began to drag Gaara away, but Temari had paused. Please don't kill them, she hesitated. I know they're attacking your village, but they didn't know either. They thought they were following orders from their Kage. Nisan nodded. I will put the order out. Now, go. He didn't even pause to watch them go when he turned to the rest of them. Hey, you're with me. We need a Yamanaka. Sasuke, Shino, Shikamaru, you are now in charge of your respective teams. Do not engage unless you do not have a choice. I need you to start escorting civilians to the safe house in the Hokage Mountain. I repeat, you are not to fight. Am I understood? Ryo joined in the chorus of, yes, sir, automatically responding to Nisan's tone of voice. Stay safe, Nisan added before he and Hate disappeared. Ryo remained frozen for a few seconds, trying to process the last 10 minutes. Sasuke interrupted him by shaking his arm. We need to start waking people up. Ryo nodded and quickly ran after his team. He could think about all this later. Right now, he had some civilians to help. Thank you for watching part 7 of What If Naruto Parents Died and Naruto Becomes Shinobi to protect his brother. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Anime T23 for more exciting What If scenarios and anime content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next episode.